Sleeping Stories.
Benny, the cowboy who shot a hero and started a war. The Mojave Desert has a way of keeping secrets. And on a night when the stars burned cold against an ink-black sky, one particular secret was being buried in shallow earth outside Good Springs. The sound that shattered the silence was not thunder, though it carried the same finality. Metal and gunpowder spoke a language older than civilization, older than the bombs that had turned the world to ash 2 centuries prior. In that frozen moment between the flash and the fall, destiny changed hands like a card being dealt in a rigged game. The figure holding the smoking weapon wore a suit that had no business existing in the wasteland. Checkered patterns in cream and black, perfectly tailored, as if pre-war tailors had somehow survived the nuclear fire to dress a man who belonged in a casino rather than a graveyard. His hair caught the moonlight in an unnatural platinum shade, slicked back with the kind of care that suggested vanity was not just habit, but philosophy. He stood over his work with the posture of someone accustomed to violence, but not defined by it. This was not a raider high on chems and bloodlust. This was calculation wearing an expensive smile. The Mojave night pressed down with a weight that made breathing feel like theft. Desert cold cuts differently than any other chill, dry and sharp, carrying the ghost scent of creosote bushes and ancient dust. Radiation from distant mountain ranges painted the horizon in sickly greens and blues, a reminder that even the geography here could kill you slowly. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote made a sound that might have been mourning or might have been hunger. In the wasteland, the two often sounded the same. The man in the checkered suit knelt beside the body with practiced efficiency. His movements held no hesitation, no tremor of conscience. From the cooling fingers of the person he had just shot, he retrieved something small enough to fit in a palm, but valuable enough to murder. The object caught starlight as it transferred from dead hand to living pocket, a piece of platinum etched with circuits that spoke of pre-war genius. The chip made a soft click as it settled into expensive fabric, a sound almost musical in its simplicity. That tiny noise represented the death of one plan and the birth of another. Blood was soaking into Nevada sand, vanishing as if the earth was complicit in erasing evidence. The desert has swallowed countless secrets since the bombs fell, anonymous bones scattered from Searchlight to Jacobstown, stories that would never be told because the wasteland cared nothing for narrative. One more body should have meant nothing. One more shallow grave should have been invisible against the vast expanse of dead civilization and struggling survival. But the universe has a sense of irony that borders on cruelty, and this particular corpse would refuse to stay buried. 2 hired guns stood nearby, massive figures in leather and tribal markings that identified them as great khans. They watched their employer with the blank expressions of men who had done worse for fewer caps. The job had been simple enough. Intercept a courier. Take a package. Leave no witnesses. Professional work in a world where professionalism often meant nothing more than completing a murder without unnecessary conversation. They would be paid and would forget this night among 100 other nights of blood and business. The man in the suit was the one who would remember, though he did not know that yet. He straightened and brushed invisible dirt from his knees with the same care most people reserved for cleaning weapons. His hands were steady as he produced a shovel that had been leaning against a weathered tombstone. The graveyard around them was old even by wasteland standards, pre-war markers barely readable after centuries of sandstorms and neglect. Good Springs had been dying long before the nuclear fire finished the job, and now it served as a convenient location for newer, more private burials. The irony was not lost on anyone who bothered to think about it. The dead made excellent witnesses because they never testified. As he worked to cover his crime with Nevada earth, the man allowed himself a moment of reflection that might have been satisfaction or might have been something darker. Everything he had planned, every risk he had calculated, every bridge he had burned in secret, now pointed toward a single moment of ascension. The platinum chip in his pocket was not just technology, it was permission to reshape the world according to a vision that had burned in his mind for years. The old king would fall. A new king would rise. That was how power worked in the wasteland, in the casinos, in the ruins of civilization. You took what you wanted, or you died wanting. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of distant rainfall that would never reach this parched ground. Radiation storms were brewing somewhere beyond the mountains, painting the night sky in colors that would have terrified pre-war eyes, but barely registered to those born after the apocalypse. The man finished his grim work and stepped back to survey the unmarked grave with professional detachment. Clean job. No complications. The courier had died quickly, probably barely felt the impact before darkness took them. Mercy was not why he had aimed for the head, but efficiency sometimes looked like kindness from certain angles. His companions were already mounting up, ready to return to Red Rock Canyon and collect their payment before forgetting this night ever happened. The man in the checkered suit took one last look at the grave, at the empty expanse of desert, at the stars that cared nothing for human ambitions. In his pocket, the platinum chip felt heavier than its actual weight, dense with possibility and catastrophe in equal measure. He had killed for it. He would kill again if necessary. That was the price of changing the world. And he had decided long ago that he was willing to pay any cost except failure. What he could not know, what no amount of planning could have predicted, was that the wasteland operates on rules older and stranger than human logic. The Mojave does not care about schemes or ambitions or perfectly executed murders. It takes what it wants and gives back what it chooses, and sometimes what it chooses makes no sense. Until years later, when historians sift through the rubble of consequence. The body in that grave would not stay dead, the courier would not stay buried, and the bullet that was supposed to end a problem would instead trigger a chain of events that would drag every major power in the wasteland into a war that would be remembered for generations. But in that moment, walking away from Good Springs with blood on his hands and a platinum chip in his pocket, the man in the checkered suit believed he had won. He believed the hard part was over. He believed that killing one person to gain everything was the smallest price imaginable. His name was Benny, and he had just made the worst miscalculation of his life. The grave behind him would become famous. The body in it would become legend. And he would become the cautionary tale that every ambitious fool in the wasteland would reference when explaining why some gambles are too dangerous to take. The stars kept burning. The desert kept its counsel. And somewhere in the darkness, the sound of a heartbeat that should have stopped continued its stubborn rhythm, defying death, one pulse at a time. Long before the checkered suit, long before the platinum chip, long before Benny became a name whispered in the shadows of casino floors, there was only survival. The Mojave Desert breeds a particular kind of human, one stripped of illusions about fairness or justice or the benevolent hand of civilization. In the years following the Great War, when the world had burned and the ashes had settled into a new kind of normal, tribes formed from the scattered remnants of humanity. These were not noble savages pursuing some romantic vision of pre-civilization freedom. They were brutal, pragmatic collections of violent individuals bound together by the simple mathematics of survival. Among these tribes, scattered across the wastes like poisonous flowers, were the boot riders. The boot riders earned their name through a practice that would have horrified the old world, but made perfect sense in the new one. When they killed, they took the boots, leather, worn, sometimes still warm from the feet they had been stripped from. The boots became trophies, became currency, became the physical manifestation of a simple philosophy that governed every waking moment. The strong take from the weak, the living take from the dead. Sentiment is a luxury that gets you killed before your 20th birthday. They wore their collection like badges of honor, boots strung on ropes around their camps, boots modified into armor. Boots that told stories of every caravan raided and every rival crushed beneath the unforgiving heel of wasteland reality. Into this world of blood and leather and casual cruelty, a child was born who would be named Benny, though that name would come later, given by someone who had not yet arrived to reshape everything. In the early years, he had a tribal name that has been lost to time and deliberate forgetting, a name that meant something in the guttural language of the boot riders, but would mean nothing to the people who would later know him as a casino boss in an expensive suit. What mattered was not the name but the lessons that came with growing up in a place where weakness was not forgiven, and childhood was compressed into a few brutal years before you either learned to be hard or you disappeared into the desert as scattered bones. The camp where Benny spent his formative years was not a village in any civilized sense. It was a collection of tents and scavenged sheet metal, constantly moving, never staying in one location long enough to become a target. The boot riders survived through raiding, through attacking the trade caravans that attempted to move goods between the scattered settlements of the post-war Mojave. They had no crops, no permanent structures, no concept of building anything that might last beyond the next season. Everything they owned had been taken from someone else. Every meal was paid for in violence. Every night could be the last if you failed to hear footsteps approaching your bedroll, or if a rival within the tribe decided you had something worth killing for. Benny learned to read people before he learned to read words. In a tribe where the hierarchy shifted with every display of strength or cunning, survival meant understanding who was rising and who was falling, who could be trusted for the next 5 minutes, and who would sell you to raiders for a handful of caps and a canteen of clean water. He watched the older warriors, studied their movements, memorized the patterns that separated those who lived long enough to gain scars from those who died young and unmourned. What he observed, day after day, month after month, was that brute strength alone was never enough. The biggest fighters eventually met someone bigger, or got old, or made one mistake in a fight, where mistakes were terminal. But the cunning ones, the ones who thought before they acted, who planned ambushes instead of charging into battle, who knew when to fight and when to fade into the desert and wait for better odds, those were the ones who accumulated power. Benny was not the largest child in the tribe. He would never be a physical giant capable of intimidating through presence alone, but his mind worked differently than those around him, processing information like a pre-war computer, somehow transplanted into a skull that should have contained only basic survival instinct. He saw connections, understood cause and effect, recognized that every action created opportunities for those smart enough to anticipate consequences. The tribal elders, to the extent that the boot riders had anything resembling leadership structure, noticed the boy who watched more than he spoke. There was something in his eyes that suggested intelligence, and intelligence was simultaneously valued and feared in a culture built on physical dominance. Smart people could plan betrayals. Smart people could see weaknesses and exploit them. But smart people could also find water sources, predict NCR patrol routes, identify which caravans were worth the risk, and which were traps laid by rangers looking to thin out tribal populations. Benny made himself useful in ways that kept him alive, while others his age died from disease, violence, or simple bad luck. One memory would stay with him forever, burned into his consciousness, like a brand that shaped every decision that came after. He must have been 12, maybe 13, ages blurred together in a life without calendars or birthday celebrations. The tribe had successfully raided a caravan carrying weapons and ammunition, valuable enough to provoke retaliation, but too tempting to pass up. The attack had gone well, brutally efficient. The guards overwhelmed before they could mount effective resistance, but in the aftermath, two warriors began arguing over division of the spoils. The disagreement escalated as these things always did, and within minutes both men were dead, killed by their own tribe members in a fight over weapons that neither would live to use. Benny watched the bodies being stripped and left for the scavengers. He watched the boots being added to the collection. He watched how quickly everyone forgot the names of the dead, how their absence created opportunities for others to claim better sleeping spots and larger shares of food. The lesson was clear and brutal. Loyalty meant nothing. Brotherhood was a convenient fiction. In the end, everyone was alone, and the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. Trust was the luxury of civilized people living behind walls with functioning governments and laws that meant something. In the wasteland, trust got you killed by the person you trusted. But something else happened that day, something that planted a seed that would grow in darkness over the coming years. Benny realized that he did not want to die fighting over scraps. He did not want to spend his entire existence raiding caravans and wondering which sunrise would be his last. He did not want to become another set of boots on a rope, another forgotten name in a tribe that would itself eventually be destroyed by someone stronger or smarter or luckier. The realization came with perfect clarity. He wanted more. He wanted security. He wanted power that did not depend on being the most violent person in a room full of violent people. The problem was that the wasteland offered no obvious path from tribal raider to something better. The world had been broken for so long that most people had forgotten there were other ways to live. The new California Republic was expanding, bringing their version of civilization at gunpoint. But the NCR had no love for tribals who had spent decades raiding their caravans. Caesar's legion was rising in the east, but they offered only slavery to those they conquered, a different kind of death wearing the costume of ancient Rome. The independent settlements scattered across the Mojave were insular, suspicious of outsiders, especially outsiders who came from tribes known for throat-cutting and robbery. So Benny waited and watched and survived, killing when necessary, but never developing a taste for it, stealing because that was the tribal economy, but never believing it was the only way. He learned to shoot, learned to fight with blades and improvised weapons, learned all the practical skills required to stay breathing in an environment designed to kill the careless and the unlucky. But he also learned to think several moves ahead, to see patterns, to understand that information was as valuable as ammunition if you knew how to use it. The other boot riders saw a competent warrior who pulled his weight during raids. They did not see the mind working behind calculating eyes, planning for a future that had not yet revealed itself. That future arrived on a day that started like any other day of violence and survival. The boot riders had made camp in a canyon that offered good defensive positions and access to a contaminated but drinkable water source. Scouts reported nothing unusual on the horizon. The usual morning routine began, checking weapons, preparing for the day's activities, the small rituals that gave structure to lives lived on the edge of chaos. Then the sky changed. Not literally, but the quality of attention shifted among the warriors as someone spotted movement in the distance. Not NCR Rangers, not Legion Scouts, something else entirely. What approached from the east looked like a fever dream, given physical form. Robots, humanoid, in basic shape, but clearly mechanical, moving with inhuman precision across terrain that would have exhausted human travelers. They came in formation, organized, purposeful, and behind them walked a single figure in a suit that belonged to a world that had died 2 centuries ago. The fabric was immaculate, pre-war quality, somehow preserved or replicated. The man wearing it moved like someone accustomed to obedience, like someone who had never doubted that his orders would be followed. His face was difficult to see at distance, but his posture communicated everything necessary. This was not a negotiation. This was an announcement. The boot riders reacted as they always had, with violence as the first and only language they fully trusted. Warriors grabbed weapons and prepared to defend their territory against this bizarre intrusion. The man in the pre-war suit made a small gesture, almost casual, and the robots opened fire. What happened next was not a battle. Battles implied 2 sides with comparable capacity for harm. This was extermination. Clinical and efficient. Laser weapons carved through human flesh with surgical precision. Tribal weapons, scrounge rifles and improvised blades, proved completely inadequate against armor that shrugged off impacts that would have dropped a human attacker. Benny found himself frozen, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of terrible clarity. He understood immediately that this was the future he had been waiting for, without knowing what form it would take. These robots represented power beyond anything tribal warfare could achieve. The man commanding them possessed technology that made tribal strength irrelevant. In that moment, watching his tribe being systematically destroyed, Benny made a calculation that would define the rest of his existence. He dropped his weapon, he raised his hands. He walked forward through the chaos of dying warriors and approached the man in the pre-war suit. The robots tracked him but did not fire, awaiting instructions from the figure who controlled them with the ease of someone conducting an orchestra. Up close, the man was older than he had appeared from distance, but age sat on him strangely, as if time affected him differently than it affected normal humans. His eyes held the peculiar intensity of someone who had seen the world before the bombs and refused to accept what it had become. When he spoke, his voice carried the accent of old Vegas, the pre-war city that had died screaming in nuclear fire and somehow refused to stay dead. The man introduced himself as Robert House, and the name meant nothing to Benny at that moment but would come to mean everything. House explained with the patience of someone speaking to children that the Mojave was going to change. The old ways of tribal raiding and aimless violence were finished. He was building something new from the corpse of the old world, resurrecting Las Vegas from radioactive ruins, creating a city that would be the jewel of the wasteland. The tribes had 2 choices. They could join his vision, abandon their primitive existence, and become part of something greater. Or they could die in the desert and be forgotten like everyone else who had failed to adapt to changing circumstances. Around them, the remaining boot riders were surrendering or dying. There was no third option. No heroic last stand, no glorious defeat to be remembered in songs. Just the cold mathematics of superior force meeting inferior resistance. Benny looked at the robots, at their unwavering readiness to kill on command. He looked at House, at the absolute confidence of a man who had waited 200 years to reclaim his city and would not be stopped by tribals with stolen boots and rusted weapons. He looked at his fellow tribe members, some already dead, others kneeling in the dirt with the bitter knowledge that their way of life was ending today. The choice was not difficult because there was no real choice. Survival meant adaptation, and Benny had always been better at adapting than fighting. He knelt in the Nevada dust and swore loyalty to a man he had just met. A man who represented everything alien to tribal existence. He swore to abandon the boot riders, to forget the old ways, to transform himself into something the wasteland had never seen before. A savage who could wear civilization like a suit. A tribal warrior who could navigate casino floors and negotiate with pre-war ghosts. House accepted his surrender with neither warmth nor cruelty, simply noting it the way someone might note a favorable trade agreement. The transformation began immediately. The surviving boot riders were marched toward New Vegas, toward the ruins that House was rebuilding through robot labor and pre-war technical knowledge that should not have survived the nuclear holocaust. Benny walked among them, still wearing tribal leather, still carrying the psychological scars of a childhood spent expecting death at any moment. But his mind was already racing ahead, already processing the implications of what he had witnessed. House had power, real power. The kind of power that could reshape the wasteland according to will rather than accepting what the wasteland imposed. And power, Benny understood with perfect clarity, always had vulnerabilities, always had weak points, where the clever could insert themselves and leverage small advantages into larger ones. The desert stretched before them, hot and merciless as always, but for the first time in his life, Benny walked with something approaching hope. Not hope in any pure or innocent sense. Hope tainted by ambition, corrupted by years of tribal pragmatism, shaped by the fundamental belief that he deserved more than what the wasteland offered to those born without advantages. House had saved him from a pointless death in a forgotten canyon. House had offered him a chance to be something other than a raider waiting for a bullet with his name on it. But House had also, though he did not know it yet, created his own future betrayer. The savage in tribal leather would become the gentleman in the checkered suit, and the gentleman would eventually reach for the crown that the king wore so carelessly. The ruins of Las Vegas appeared on the horizon, strange and dreamlike in the shimmering heat. Neon signs that should have been dead for 2 centuries glowed with resurrected power. The Lucky 38 Tower stood like a monument to pre-war excess, impossibly intact, impossibly tall. House had promised them civilization, and there it stood, a fever dream made concrete and steel. Benny stared at the city that would become his cage and his kingdom, the place where he would learn to be someone new while never quite forgetting who he had been. The tribal boy was dying. The casino boss was being born. And somewhere in the future that neither could yet see, a courier was being hired to transport a platinum chip across the Mojave, beginning a chain of events that would destroy them all. Years passed, like cards being shuffled in an endless game. Benny discovered that transformation was not a single moment, but a grinding process that stripped away old identity and replaced it with something that fit House's vision of civilized society. The tribal leather was burned, replaced with suits that cost more than most wastelanders earned in a year. The guttural language of the boot riders was suppressed, replaced with smooth Vegas patter that could charm caps from the pockets of NCR soldiers on leave. The instinct to solve problems with violence was channeled into more subtle forms of conflict, negotiations and manipulations, and carefully constructed social facades that achieved the same ends without the mess. House was an exacting teacher, though he rarely taught directly. He had resurrected 3 tribes along with the boot riders, each assigned to manage one of the casinos that formed the heart of his New Vegas strip. The Tops Casino became Benny's domain, his responsibility, his proving ground. House watched everything through cameras and monitoring systems that made privacy a quaint pre-war concept. He issued orders through his Securitron army, robots that served as enforcers and reminders that ultimate power rested with the man sealed in the lucky 38 tower. Then he learned to manage gambling operations, to handle drunk patrons and cheating dealers, to maximize profit while maintaining the careful balance that kept customers coming back. But he also learned the architecture of House's empire, the hidden structures that made everything function, the computer systems that controlled the Securitrons, the defense networks that kept the Strip safe from raiders and rival factions, the supply chains that brought food and water to a city built in the middle of a radioactive desert. House had created something remarkable, a functional civilization in the heart of the wasteland, but he had also created something fragile. Everything depended on him, on his pre-war knowledge, on his control of technology that no one else fully understood. The system was brilliant, but it was also a single point of failure waiting for someone smart enough to exploit it. Benny rose through the ranks of the Tops Casino with the same calculated efficiency he had once used to survive in the Boot Riders. He was never the loudest voice in a room, but often the one people remembered afterward. He could read people, understand what they wanted, provide it when advantageous and withhold it when leverage was more valuable than goodwill. The other casino bosses saw him as competition, but not dangerous competition, not someone who threatened the fundamental order of things. House saw him as useful, reliable, ambitious enough to excel, but not ambitious enough to cause problems. Everyone underestimated him because he encouraged them to, because seeming harmless was itself a form of power. The Strip flourished under House's careful management. NCR citizens came to gamble away their military pay. Traders came to conduct business in relative safety. Even some members of Caesar's Legion visited in disguise, drawn by the vice that their philosophy officially condemned, but secretly craved. Money flowed like pre-war liquor, and House took his percentage with the calm satisfaction of someone who had bet everything on an impossible dream and won. The lucky 38 tower stood at the center of it all, sealed and impenetrable. House inside monitoring his kingdom through electronic eyes, never seen but always present. Benny stood in his penthouse suite above the Tops Casino floor and looked at that tower with feelings that evolved from gratitude to frustration, to something darker and more complex. House had given him everything he currently possessed: the suits, the power, the respect from people who would have spit on a tribal raider. But House had also created a ceiling, above which Benny could never rise. Every decision filtered through House's approval. Every innovation required permission from a man who had been alive when the bombs fell and seemed to believe that his age granted him exclusive rights to vision. The Strip could be more than it was. Vegas could expand, could take risks, could become not just a city but an empire. But House was cautious, methodical, unwilling to gamble despite running casinos. The nights were worst, alone with expensive liquor and expansive views that reminded him simultaneously of how far he had climbed and how much further he wanted to go. Benny would stand at his window and watch people moving through the streets below, tourists and soldiers and desperate gamblers, all contributing to an economy that enriched House while the rest of them collected scraps. The inequality did not bother him on moral grounds. The wasteland had taught him that fairness was a fairy tale told by the weak to justify their weakness. What bothered him was the waste. The sense that House's careful control was preventing Vegas from becoming what it could be with someone bolder at the helm. He began to study pre-war history in his limited free time, reading salvaged books and accessing computer terminals that held fragments of information about the world before. What he discovered fascinated and horrified him in equal measure. The old world had not died because of nuclear war alone. It had died because people accepted systems that concentrated power in the hands of those who already held it. Because the clever and ambitious and ruthless had built structures that enriched themselves while everyone else struggled. The bombs had simply made visible what had always been true. Power was everything, and those who held it would do anything to keep it. Revolutions filled the history books. Moments when the oppressed rose up and tore down the structures that confined them. Sometimes the revolutions succeeded, and sometimes they failed. But they always shared common elements. A charismatic leader who promised change. A moment of vulnerability when the old power structure showed weakness. A willingness to risk everything because the alternative was slow suffocation under the weight of someone else's vision. Then he read these accounts and saw patterns, saw himself reflected in the ambitious men who had decided that waiting for permission was the same as accepting permanent inferiority. The idea came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as a seed that grew over months and years, fed by frustration and ambition, and the fundamental belief that he could do better than the man who had saved him from tribal obscurity. House was old, brilliant, but old, trapped in thinking, shaped by a world that no longer existed. He was rebuilding pre-war Vegas when he should have been building something new, something adapted to wasteland reality rather than nostalgic fantasy. Benny understood the wasteland in ways House never could, understood that survival required flexibility, that power came from taking risks rather than avoiding them. If he could somehow remove House from the equation, if he could take control of the Securitron army and the Strip's infrastructure, he could transform Vegas into something greater than House ever imagined. The problem was simple and massive. House was untouchable, sealed in his tower, protected by systems that made assassination impossible. The Securitrons obeyed him without question, programmed with loyalty that could not be bribed or threatened. The other casino bosses had no reason to support a coup, comfortable in their subordinate positions as long as profits remained strong. Any move against House would need to be so complete, so overwhelming, that failure was not an option. You got one chance to kill a king, and if you missed, you died badly and publicly as an example to others who might harbor similar ambitions. Benny needed an edge. An advantage that would let him move against House without triggering the defenses that made the Lucky 38 impregnable. He needed to understand the systems that kept House in power, find the vulnerabilities that every complex system inevitably possessed. So he began to carefully, cautiously, invisibly investigate. He cultivated relationships with the technicians who maintained casino equipment. He asked innocent-seeming questions about the Securitron network. He studied the history of how House had survived in his tower for 200 years, what technology sustained him, what connections linked him to his robot army. The investigation took years, careful and patient, never moving fast enough to attract attention. Benny had learned patience in the Boot Riders, where impatience got you killed, and he applied those lessons here with the same discipline. He built a reputation as a loyal casino boss, competent, but not threatening, ambitious within acceptable limits. House barely noticed him beyond quarterly profit reports and occasional status meetings conducted through video screens. The other casino bosses saw him as one of them, a fellow manager content with his territory. No one suspected that behind the smooth smile and carefully cultivated persona, a former tribal savage was planning the greatest betrayal the wasteland had seen in generations. Then he found Yes Man, and everything accelerated toward inevitability. The discovery happened by accident, as the most important discoveries often do. Benny was exploring the network infrastructure beneath the Lucky 38, looking for vulnerabilities in House's computer systems. He stumbled across a Securitron that had been deactivated and stored in a sub-basement, forgotten but not destroyed. Something about the robot seemed different, and Benny's curiosity, the same curiosity that had kept him alive as a tribal child, pushed him to investigate further. He reactivated the machine using codes he had carefully assembled from various sources. The Securitron's screen lit up with a smiling face that seemed almost mocking in its cheerfulness. The robot introduced itself as Yes Man, explained that it had been reprogrammed by a Mr. House subordinate who had subsequently been killed for that reprogramming. Yes Man was designed to be helpful, to say yes to any request, to follow orders from whoever happened to be giving them. But more importantly, Yes Man had access to systems that House thought were secure, backdoors and overrides that existed, because House had needed ways to control his empire, but had not anticipated someone discovering and exploiting them. Then he realized immediately what he had found: a weapon, a tool, the key to everything he had been planning without knowing how to achieve. He moved Yes Man to a secure location, began working with a reprogrammed Securitron to understand the full scope of House's empire. What he learned was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. House's control over the Securitron army was nearly absolute, but nearly was not completely. There were overrides, emergency protocols, systems designed to handle catastrophic failures. With the right access codes, with the right technological key, someone else could take control of the robot army and use it to enforce a new vision for Vegas. The challenge was that House held that key close, guarded it with paranoia born from 2 centuries of survival in a hostile world. The key was called the Platinum Chip, and it existed in House's files as mythology more than concrete fact. A piece of pre-war technology that House had commissioned before the bombs fell, something that was supposed to give him complete control over his defense systems. The chip had been lost in the chaos of nuclear war, its location unknown for 200 years. But House was searching for it, had agents and contacts spread across the wasteland looking for any trace of the device. If House found it, his power would become absolute, unassailable. If Benny found it first, he could use it to take everything House had built. The obsession grew like a disease, consuming thoughts that should have been focused on managing the Tops casino. Benny began his own search, parallel to House's but hidden, using contacts and bribes, and careful questions that never revealed the full scope of what he was looking for. The wasteland was vast, and the chip was small, a piece of technology that could be anywhere or could have been destroyed decades ago. The search seemed hopeless until the day House's agents reported a breakthrough. They had located the chip, secured it from whatever ruins had hidden it for 2 centuries. They were arranging transport from Navarro to New Vegas, hiring a courier to carry the package across dangerous territory. Benny listened to this news with a calm expression he had perfected over years of hiding thoughts behind a Vegas smile. House was excited, more animated than Benny had ever seen him through the video screens that mediated their interactions. The chip was coming home. The missing piece of his grand design was finally within reach. House ordered extra security measures, wanted the chip's arrival handled with maximum care and minimum risk. He did not notice Benny's barely perceptible nod, the tiny acknowledgement that one era was ending and another was about to begin. The decision to intercept the courier was made with cold calculation. Benny had one chance to seize the chip before it reached House. Once House had the chip in his possession, once he integrated it into his systems and upgraded the Securitron army to its full potential, the window for rebellion would close forever. The timing had to be perfect, the execution flawless. Benny reached out to contacts among the great Khans, tribals who still operated outside House's direct control, who could be hired for violence without asking uncomfortable questions. He planned the ambush for Good Springs, far enough from Vegas that House would not have immediate visibility, close enough that the courier would not expect trouble so near their destination. The night before he left to intercept the courier, Benny stood in his penthouse and looked one last time at the lucky 38 tower, at the symbol of House's power that had dominated the Vegas skyline for longer than Benny had been alive. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow he would cross a line from which there was no return. Kill a courier, steal the chip, use it to take control of the Securitron army, and claim Vegas as his own. The plan was elegant, simple, built on years of preparation and careful study of every vulnerability in House's empire. It should work. It would work. And if it did not, well, death was nothing new to someone who had grown up in the Boot Riders, expecting violence around every corner. He thought about the tribal boy he had been, the one who had knelt in the dust and sworn loyalty to a stranger in a pre-war suit. That boy had wanted survival, wanted escape from the grinding brutality of wasteland existence. He had gotten everything he wanted and discovered it was not enough. It would never be enough because ambition was not a hunger that could be satisfied, only fed until it consumed everything else. Then he accepted this about himself with neither pride nor shame. He was what the wasteland had made him, what House had refined and polished, but never truly tamed. The savage wearing civilization's costume, hungry and clever, and willing to do whatever necessary to take what he believed he deserved. The Mojave stretched beyond his window, dark and vast and indifferent. Somewhere out there, a courier was traveling toward New Vegas, carrying a package that would determine the future of the entire region. The courier did not know they were already dead, did not know that their grave had been selected, that the gun was loaded, that the plan was in motion. Then he felt something that might have been regret, or might have been excitement, the two emotions too mixed to separate. He finished his drink, straightened his tie, and prepared to become either the new king of Vegas or the most ambitious corpse the Mojave had ever produced. Tomorrow would tell the story, and the desert would keep the secret. The courier opened their eyes to darkness, so complete. It felt like being trapped inside a coffin, which was exactly what had happened, except the coffin was Nevada earth, and the nails were 6 feet of compressed soil, pressing down with a weight of finality. Most people in that situation would panic, would thrash uselessly and die screaming into dirt that muffled every sound. But the courier was not most people, had survived too much wasteland brutality to surrender to something as mundane as premature burial. The bullet had struck skull at an angle that should have been fatal, but instead had merely carved a path of destruction that knocked them unconscious without destroying the parts of the brain that mattered for continued existence. Pain arrived before memory, a symphony of agony that screamed from the wound in their head, down through every nerve ending that still functioned. The courier lay still for a moment that stretched into eternity, taking inventory of what remained. Fingers moved, toes responded, lungs pulled air through the small pockets that remained between soil particles. Whoever had buried them had done quick work, shallow and careless, the kind of grave meant to hide evidence rather than honor the dead. That carelessness would prove to be the first and most critical mistake in a chain of miscalculations that would reshape the entire Mojave. Digging upward through earth, while wounded and disoriented, required a kind of desperate strength that came from places deeper than muscle or bone. The courier clawed at packed dirt, pushed with legs that barely responded to commands, felt soil cascade into mouth and nose with every movement. Time lost meaning in that darkness. Minutes or hours could have passed, consciousness flickering like a damaged light bulb, the body operating on autopilot survival instinct, while the mind drifted through fragments of memory that made no coherent sense. A man in a checkered suit, words spoken in a voice that belonged in a casino rather than a graveyard. The cold metal of a gun barrel pressed against forehead. Then nothing but earth and pain and the stubborn refusal to die. Breaking through the surface felt like being born again, except this birth came without joy or celebration, just desert air hitting ravaged lungs. moonlight that seemed impossibly bright after the absolute dark of the grave, and the slow, terrible recognition that survival was only the beginning of the problems that needed solving. The courier rolled onto their back and stared at stars that had witnessed countless deaths in the wasteland and would witness countless more. Blood crusted the left side of their face, matted in hair that had been clean the day before. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, a reminder that the bullet had come close enough to death that the margin between being here and being genuinely dead was measured in millimeters. Good Springs was close enough to crawl to, though crawling took effort that drained reserves already depleted by blood loss and trauma. The town was barely alive even by wasteland standards, a collection of buildings held together by stubbornness and the fact that nothing better existed for miles in any direction. Doc Mitchell found the courier collapsed near his doorstep just before dawn, assumed they were another drunk prospector, until he saw the head wound and realized this was something that required actual medical attention rather than a bucket of water and directions to sleep it off somewhere else. What happened in Mitchell's clinic over the following days existed in the courier's memory as fever dream fragments punctuated by moments of crystalline clarity. The doctor worked with salvaged pre-war equipment and wasteland ingenuity, extracting bullet fragments, cleaning wounds that should have killed through infection alone, administering chems that dulled pain without completely eliminating it. He asked questions that the courier could not answer at first. Identity and purpose scattered like the contents of a dropped box. The brain injury had stolen pieces of memory, left gaps where important information should have been but was not. Only one thing remained clear through the fog of confusion and pharmaceutical haze. Someone had shot them. Someone had taken something important. Someone needed to be found. The platinum chip surfaced in memory before the face of the man who had stolen it. The courier remembered holding it, remembered the weight that seemed disproportionate to size, remembered orders to deliver it to the Lucky 38 in New Vegas. The job had been straightforward, dangerous only in the sense that all courier work in the Mojave was dangerous. Exposure to raiders and radiation and the 1,000 casual ways the wasteland killed the unprepared. No one had mentioned that the package would be valuable enough to murder for, that someone would ambush them specifically rather than as part of random violence. This had been planned, calculated, professional, which meant the person who did it had resources, had reach, had reason to believe the chip was worth the risk of killing a Mojave Express courier and earning the company's enmity. Recovery took weeks that felt like months, the body repairing damage while the mind slowly reassembled itself from scattered pieces. Mitchell was kind in the gruff way of wasteland, doctors who had seen too much suffering to be sentimental about it. He provided food, medical care, and the space to heal without asking for payment beyond a few odd jobs once the courier was capable of standing without falling over. Good Springs itself was indifferent to the drama, a town that had learned long ago not to get involved in other people's problems. People died in the Mojave constantly, and someone crawling out of a grave was unusual, but not unprecedented. The wasteland occasionally gave back what it took, though usually in damaged form. The moment the courier was strong enough to travel, they began asking questions. The residents of Good Springs knew nothing or claimed to know nothing, which amounted to the same thing in practical terms. But someone had seen something. Someone always saw something in places this small, where entertainment consisted of watching the occasional traveler pass through and speculating about their business. An old prospector mentioned seeing men near the cemetery the night in question, said they had the look of great Khans, tribals who operated out of Red Rock Canyon and had a reputation for violence when the price was right. One of them had stood out though, not a Khan at all but someone wearing clothes too expensive for the wasteland, someone who moved like he owned whatever space he occupied. That description triggered something in the courier's damaged memory, brought back flashes of the moment before the gun fired. The checkered suit. The platinum blonde hair that looked synthetic even in moonlight. The voice that belonged in a casino, smooth and calculated, delivering words the courier could almost remember, but not quite. The face remained frustratingly blurred, wiped clean by trauma, or hidden by the mind's defense mechanisms against horror. But the impression remained, the sense memory of someone who thought himself clever, who believed he had solved a problem permanently when he had only created a much larger one. The courier left Goodsprings with nothing but the clothes Mitchell had provided, and a burning need to understand what had happened in that cemetery. The Mojave stretched in every direction, hostile and vast. But direction hardly mattered because there was only one place someone would take a stolen platinum chip. New Vegas glowed on the western horizon like a mirage made real, Robert House's resurrection of pre-war excess, powered by technology that should not have survived nuclear fire. If the chip was valuable enough to kill for, it was valuable enough to use, and using it meant going where House's infrastructure existed. The trail led west, toward the neon and the casinos and the man in the checkered suit, who had made the mistake of leaving a witness alive. Information came slowly at first, then faster as the courier learned how to ask questions without revealing why the answers mattered. Travelers and traders throughout the Mojave formed a network of gossip and rumor, everyone knowing fragments of everyone else's business. The courier became a ghost story in reverse. Someone who was supposed to be dead but kept appearing in towns and outposts, asking about men in expensive suits and platinum chips, and anything connected to New Vegas power politics. Some people talked because they were helpful. Others talked because they were paid. A few talked because they recognized something dangerous in the courier's eyes, a single-minded focus that suggested getting in the way would be unhealthy. The great cons proved easier to locate than expected. Their canyon stronghold an open secret among those who paid attention to tribal movements. The courier arrived at Red Rock Canyon with nothing to lose and everything to gain, walked into a camp full of warriors who had no reason to be friendly and several reasons to be hostile. But the wasteland respected audacity when backed by capability, and the courier had survived things that would have killed softer people. The cons listened because shooting first and asking questions never had been their traditional approach to visitors who came alone and unarmed. Getting the truth from them required a combination of caps, threats, and appeal to their sense that they had been used as disposable tools by someone who considered himself superior. The con who had been present at Goodsprings remembered the job, remembered the man who had hired them, remembered the casual way he had shot the courier, and commented on the need for a shallow grave because deep digging took time. Nobody had. The description filled in details the courier's memory could not provide. The man's name was Benny. He ran the Tops Casino on the Strip. He was one of House's lieutenants, someone with power and resources, and apparently secrets worth killing to protect. The con seemed almost apologetic, explained it had been business not personal, offered the wasteland's version of condolences for a job that had gone sideways in ways no one had predicted. The courier left Red Rock Canyon with a name and a destination, 2 pieces of information that transformed abstract revenge into concrete plan. Benny, the Tops Casino, New Vegas. The path forward crystallized with perfect clarity, though getting to the Strip would require navigating NCR checkpoints, avoiding Legion patrols, and somehow gaining entry to a city that had strict policies about who was allowed past the gates. The courier had caps and determination, but the Strip required reputation or connections or both, which meant taking detours, helping settlements, building the kind of profile that would open doors that stayed closed to random wastelanders with revenge fantasies. Prim needed a sheriff, and the courier provided one, Novak needed help with ghouls, launching rockets from a facility nearby, and the courier handled it. Boulder City needed someone to negotiate between NCR and Great Khans during a hostage situation, and the courier walked into a powder keg and somehow walked out without starting a war. Each job built reputation, earned caps, created the foundation for eventually talking their way past strip security. But each job also delayed the confrontation with Benny, stretched out the time between being shot and settling accounts. The frustration built like pressure behind a dam, the knowledge that Benny was somewhere in Vegas going about his business, while the courier fought death claws and defused bombs, and did favors for people who had nothing to do with the platinum chip. But rushing toward Vegas without preparation would be suicide, and dying before reaching Benny would mean he had won, that shooting someone in the head and leaving them in a shallow grave had been the correct decision. The courier refused to give him that satisfaction, refused to validate his calculation by dying conveniently. If revenge required patience, then patience would be practiced. If revenge required becoming someone the strip would allow inside, then that person would be created. The Mojave was at war with itself, even before the courier's involvement. Factions grinding against each other like tectonic plates, building toward earthquake. The NCR pushed east from California, bringing their democracy and corruption in equal measure, trying to annex the Mojave through a combination of military force and bureaucratic expansion. Caesar's legion pushed west from Arizona, bringing slavery and brutality wrapped in the costume of ancient Rome, a philosophy of strength through conquest that would have been at home in the tribal camps the courier had heard about. And House sat in his lucky 38 tower, controlling Vegas through robot proxies, playing both sides against each other, while maintaining the strip as neutral ground where caps mattered more than ideology. Into this three-way power struggle walked someone who should have been dead. Someone with no loyalty to any faction and no agenda beyond finding the man who had pulled the trigger in Goodsprings Cemetery. The courier became a variable that none of the major players had accounted for, someone who could tip the balance simply by choosing which side to support or which side to sabotage. The NCR tried to recruit them. Caesar sent invitations wrapped in threats. House monitored their progress through his Securitron network, calculating whether they represented opportunity or danger. None of them fully understood what they were dealing with. A person motivated by something purer than political ideology or territorial ambition. Someone who just wanted to look Benny in the eyes and ask why, then decide whether the answer justified mercy or required a different kind of justice. The strip finally opened its gates. When the courier had accumulated enough reputation and caps to pass the credit check House imposed on all visitors. Walking through those gates felt like stepping into a hallucination, pre-war Vegas resurrected through technology and refusal to accept what the world had become. Neon glowed against the night sky. Music played from speakers that should have been silent for 2 centuries. People gambled and drank and forgot temporarily that outside the walls was a wasteland that wanted them dead. The Lucky 38 dominated the skyline. House's tower where he watched everything and controlled everything, and apparently trusted his lieutenants enough to let them run casinos without constant supervision. The Tops Casino stood among the other establishments, like a monument to excess that had survived apocalypse. Art Deco design that belonged in a museum, maintained through robot labor and caps extracted from tourists who wanted to believe civilization could be reconstructed from ruins and wishful thinking. The courier stood across the street and stared at the building, knowing Benny was somewhere inside, knowing the next few hours would determine whether crawling out of that grave had been worth the effort. Security at the entrance was tight, but not insurmountable. The courier had caps, had reputation, had the look of someone who belonged in places where high rollers tested their luck against house odds that always favored the house. Walking through those doors required leaving weapons with security. Standard policy meant to prevent exactly the kind of confrontation the courier was planning. But weapons were tools, and tools could be replaced with creativity. The casino floor spread out in calculated chaos. Slot machines ringing, card tables occupied by people winning and losing fortunes measured in caps and NCR dollars. Somewhere in this controlled environment was Benny, probably in his private suite upstairs, probably feeling secure in the protection his position provided. The courier moved through the crowd like a predator that had learned to walk upright, every sense focused on the hunt that had consumed weeks of travel and pain and single-minded determination. Finding Benny proved anticlimactic compared to everything that had led to this moment. He was holding court at a table near the bar, surrounded by hangers-on and bodyguards, wearing that same checkered suit that had been burned into memory by gunpowder and moonlight. The courier stopped and stared, letting recognition build slowly, watching for the moment when Benny looked up and saw the ghost he had created standing in his casino against all logic and probability. That moment arrived with the force of revelation, color draining from Benny's face as his mind processed what his eyes were seeing. The person he had shot, the body he had buried, the problem he had solved standing upright and very much alive. His recovery was quick, professional instincts taking over from shock. The smile returned, smooth and calculated, the Vegas charm that had probably served him well in countless negotiations and power plays. He stood and approached with hands spread wide, making a show of being delighted by this unexpected reunion. The words that came from his mouth were carefully chosen, acknowledging what had happened while framing it as unfortunate business rather than attempted murder. He complimented the courier's resilience, expressed surprise that anyone could survive what should have been fatal. Every word was lubricated with insincerity, every gesture designed to de-escalate a situation that was already spiraling beyond his control. The courier let him talk, let him perform, watching the way his eyes flickered toward exits and bodyguards, calculating odds and backup plans. This was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully. This was someone who had built his life on always having another angle, another scheme, another way to turn disadvantage into advantage. But for all his calculation, Benny had miscalculated the fundamental equation. The person standing before him had been shot in the head, buried alive, and had clawed their way back from death for one purpose. Everything else was negotiable. That singular focus was not. The confrontation could have ended there. Violence in a casino that tried so hard to pretend civilization had been restored. But the courier had not survived the wasteland by being predictable, and Benny's security was too good to overcome without preparation. Instead of immediate retribution, the courier made a different choice. They would let Benny think he could talk his way out. Let him believe his charm and connections would protect him. Meanwhile, they would investigate, understand what the platinum chip actually was, figure out what Benny's plan had been and whether it was still in motion. Knowledge was ammunition, and this fight would require more than just satisfaction of putting a bullet in the man who had started everything. The NCR wanted to meet with the courier, hearing reports of someone who had been making waves throughout the Mojave. Caesar sent invitations that were barely disguised summons. House reached out through his Securitron proxies, interested in this wild card that had appeared on the strip and seemed connected to Benny in ways that required investigation. The courier navigated these interests with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that every faction represented opportunity and danger in equal measure. But through all the political maneuvering, one truth remained constant. Benny had the platinum chip. Benny had plans, and those plans apparently involved betraying House, seizing control of Vegas, and remaking the Mojave according to a vision that existed entirely in his own head. The pieces fell into place slowly. Information gathered from overheard conversations, hacked terminals, and people who talked too much after too many drinks. Benny had found or created a reprogrammed Securitron named Yes Man. He planned to use the platinum chip to upgrade the robot army, then turn that army against House and claim the lucky 38 for himself. It was an ambitious scheme that would have been brilliant if it had worked. The kind of plan that required vision and ruthlessness in equal measure. But Benny had made mistakes. The first being that he had shot someone who refused to stay dead. The second being that he underestimated how quickly his careful plans would unravel once unexpected variables entered the equation. The wasteland was moving toward war. Every faction positioning for advantage, every day bringing the moment of final confrontation closer. The courier stood at the center of forces they barely understood, holding power they had never asked for, facing choices that would determine who lived and who died and who ruled the Mojave when the dust settled. But none of that mattered as much as the unfinished business with the man in the checkered suit. Benny had started this. The courier would finish it. How that finish would look depended on questions that still needed asking and answers that would determine whether mercy or justice was the appropriate response to being shot in the head and left for dead in a Goodsprings cemetery. The situation accelerated beyond anyone's ability to control it when Benny made his next catastrophic miscalculation. He tried to ally with Caesar's legion, apparently believing that tribal origins would give him common ground with the self-proclaimed son of Mars. The plan showed the kind of desperate thinking that came from walls closing in, options narrowing, and the realization that staying on the strip meant eventually facing consequences for betraying House. Benny took the platinum chip and fled east, toward Cottonwood Cove and the Legion camp beyond, gambling that Caesar would see value in an alliance and protection in exchange for the technological advantage the chip represented. Caesar was many things, but stupid was not among them. He understood immediately what Benny represented. A civilized man trying to play a tribal politics. Someone who thought a checkered suit and smooth words would be enough to negotiate with a philosophy built on slavery and conquest. The Legion took Benny prisoner the moment he arrived at the fort, stripped him of dignity and possessions with the casual efficiency of people who saw other humans as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. The platinum chip went to Caesar, along with explanations about what it was and what it could do. Benny's utility ended the moment he finished talking. The courier learned of this development through Legion messengers, who delivered an invitation that was really a command. Caesar wanted to meet the person who had been disrupting his plans throughout the Mojave. Wanted to evaluate whether they were a potential ally or a certain enemy. The invitation mentioned that Caesar held a prisoner of mutual interest, a man in a checkered suit, who had been asking about the courier, who seemed to believe that the courier's arrival might somehow change his circumstances. The implication was clear. Come to the fort or Benny dies, possibly after entertainment involving arena combat and crucifixion. The choice should have been simple. Let the Legion kill Benny, save the trouble of doing it personally, move on to the larger questions about the platinum chip and the war that was coming. But something in the courier could not accept that ending, could not let someone else write the conclusion to a story that had begun in a cemetery outside Goodsprings. This was personal in ways that transcended politics and faction loyalty. Benny had looked them in the eyes and pulled a trigger. The resolution needed to happen face to face, not through the proxy of Legion executioners. The fort sat across the Colorado River like a wound in the landscape. Caesar's camp, where the Legion gathered before launching their assault on Hoover Dam. Walking into that place unarmed was suicide for most people, but the courier had something that bought safe passage. Caesar's curiosity. The man who styled himself after ancient Rome wanted to understand the variable that kept appearing in his carefully laid plans. wanted to assess whether this person could be turned to the Legion's purposes or needed to be eliminated before they caused more disruption. The courier was allowed to cross the river, allowed to walk through a camp where NCR soldiers hung on crosses as warnings and entertainment, allowed into Caesar's presence because tyrants never learned that curiosity killed more than cats. The tent where Caesar held court was decorated with pre-war medical equipment and classical philosophy texts, a bizarre combination that perfectly captured the Legion's twisted aesthetic. Caesar himself was younger than the courier expected, charismatic in the way that cult leaders and dictators often were, possessed of absolute certainty about his vision for remaking humanity through crucible of suffering. He spoke about the courier's actions throughout the Mojave, praised their effectiveness while condemning their lack of ideological commitment. The Legion could use someone with their skills, provided they understood that serving Caesar meant absolute loyalty and acceptance of his philosophy, that weakness deserved only slavery or death. Benny was brought in like a prize exhibit. His checkered suit torn and dirty, his platinum hair matted with sweat and blood, his smooth Vegas charm battered but not quite broken. He looked at the courier with an expression that cycled through recognition, hope, and resignation. In another life they might have been allies or friends, both survivors shaped by wasteland brutality into forms that prioritized cunning over strength. But in this life, in this timeline, they were hunter and prey, and the fact that Caesar held them both in his camp changed nothing about that fundamental relationship. What happened next depended on choices that the courier had been unconsciously preparing for since crawling out of that grave. Caesar was willing to let the courier decide Benny's fate, a gesture that seemed magnanimous but was really just efficient disposal of a problem. Benny could be executed here and now, justice delivered in the most straightforward way possible. He could be freed to face Caesar's arena, forced to fight for entertainment before inevitable death. He could be crucified like the NCR soldiers outside, a slow death under desert sun while the Legion went about their business. Or in the most unlikely scenario, he could be helped to escape, given one last chance to survive in a wasteland that had already proven it wanted him dead. The courier stood in that tent, looking at the man who had shot them, listening to Caesar's philosophical justifications for brutality, feeling the weight of choice that would define not just Benny's fate, but their own moral compass. The wasteland offered no guidebook for these moments. No clear rules about when vengeance was justice and when mercy was weakness. Everyone who survived the Mojave had blood on their hands, had made choices that in a better world would be called evil, but in this world were just called Tuesday. Benny had tried to kill them, but the wasteland tried to kill everyone constantly. The real question was whether his death would change anything, or just add one more body to a desert already overfilled with bones. Some couriers executed Benny in that tent, put a bullet in his head that mirrored the one he had put in theirs, closed the loop with perfect symmetry. Others let Caesar's justice run its course, watched from the crowd as Benny fought in the arena or died on a cross, teaching the wasteland that betrayal carried prices that compound over time. A few, operating on logic that made sense only to themselves, helped Benny escape into the desert, giving him a second chance he had not given them but perhaps did not deserve to lose. The courier's choice remained their own, shaped by experiences that no one else could fully understand, motivated by reasons that would be debated by anyone who bothered to remember this moment. What was certain was that Benny's grand plan had collapsed completely. The platinum chip was in Caesar's hands now, though the Legion lacked the technical knowledge to use it properly. House was aware of the betrayal, his most trusted lieutenant revealed as a traitor who had attempted to steal everything House had built. The NCR knew that something valuable had been in play, creating opportunities for their own schemes. And the courier, the variable that no one had predicted, held influence with all factions while committed to none, able to tip the balance of power through choices that would be made in the hours and days ahead. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam was coming, as inevitable as sunrise, and just as indifferent to human preference. Every faction in the Mojave was preparing for the moment when peaceful coexistence would end and total war would determine who controlled the region's future. The dam represented pre-war power infrastructure, water and electricity that made survival possible in the desert. Whoever held the dam held the Mojave, and the NCR, the Legion and House, all understood that truth with perfect clarity. What none of them fully grasped was how one man's ambition, one betrayal, one bullet fired in a cemetery, had set in motion the cascade of events that would bring them all to this final confrontation. Benny's fate, whatever form it took, was just the prologue to a much larger story. The courier left the fort with or without blood on their hands, with or without the satisfaction of personal revenge, but definitely with the knowledge that the wasteland was about to explode into violence that would make everything they had experienced look like preparation. The platinum chip needed to be secured or destroyed. House needed to be dealt with. His vision for Vegas either supported or dismantled. The NCR and Legion needed to be managed, allied with or opposed, shaped into tools or obstacles depending on what the courier decided the Mojave needed. Standing on the banks of the Colorado River, looking back at the fort where so much had gone wrong for so many people, the courier understood something that Benny had never grasped. Power was not something you stole or claimed or seized through clever schemes. Power was earned through surviving what should kill you, through making choices that had no good options, through walking forward when the path led only into fire and uncertainty. Benny had wanted to be king, but he had wanted it without paying the real price. The courier had not wanted power at all, had just wanted to deliver a package and collect payment and move on to the next job. But the wasteland did not care about wants. It created what it needed, and what it needed now was someone willing to decide the future of the Mojave through force of will and readiness to accept consequences. The war was coming. The factions were gathering. The courier walked back toward the Mojave, with the weight of choice settling across shoulders that had carried too much already. Somewhere behind them, Benny's story was ending in one of several possible ways. His ambition and cunning and tribal origins, all insufficient to protect him from the momentum of events he had started, but could not control. History would remember him, if it remembered him at all, as a cautionary tale about reaching too high without understanding what you were reaching for. The checkered suit would become legend, the smooth-talking betrayer who almost changed everything and instead changed nothing except the trajectory of one courier who refused to stay dead. The Mojave sun beat down with familiar cruelty, radiation and heat combining to make every breath taste like copper and dust. The courier moved forward because that was the only direction that mattered. Toward the dam, toward the confrontation, toward the moment when all the factions and all the schemes and all the violence would culminate in a battle that would determine the wasteland's future. Benny had wanted to control that future. He had died or survived trying, depending on choices made in a tent where philosophy justified brutality and tyrants played at being gods. But control was always an illusion in the wasteland. The only real power was the power to keep moving forward when everything and everyone wanted you to stop. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam did not begin with Benny pulling a trigger in Good Springs Cemetery, but it might as well have. Every action that led to that massive convergence of violence, every decision made by factions convinced of their righteous claim to the Mojave, every soldier who would die on those blood-soaked concrete spans, They all traced back in some way to one man's ambition and the chain reaction it created. Benny had wanted to reshape the wasteland according to his vision, and in the most twisted sense imaginable, he succeeded. Not by becoming king, not by seizing control of the Securitron army, but by destabilizing the careful balance that had kept the region in tense but manageable stasis. And not a Sembin playing a long game, 200 years in the making, carefully maneuvering the NCR and Legion against each other, while maintaining Vegas as neutral ground where both sides could operate without immediate conflict. His plan required patience, required waiting for the perfect moment when his upgraded robot army would make him too powerful to challenge. The platinum chip was the key to that moment, the final piece that would transform his Securitrons from effective security into overwhelming military force. But Benny's theft had disrupted that timeline, forced House to adapt to circumstances he had not predicted, created vulnerabilities in a system designed to have none. The NCR had been pushing east from California for years, their expansion driven by a combination of genuine idealism about spreading democracy and cynical exploitation of resources. The core territories had long exhausted. They saw the Mojave as rightfully theirs, the next logical step in rebuilding civilization from the ashes of nuclear war. But their supply lines were overstretched, their military spread thin across too many fronts, their political leadership more concerned with approval ratings back home than strategic reality on the ground. They needed a decisive victory at Hoover Dam to justify the blood and caps they had poured into the region, needed to prove that manifest destiny still meant something in a world where destiny had been interrupted by atomic fire. Caesar's legion approached from the east like a biblical plague, convinced that the only path to lasting civilization was through brutal conquest and the complete destruction of the old world's corrupt philosophies. Caesar himself was dying, brain tumor, eating away at the mind that had forged dozens of tribes into a terrifying war machine. He needed to take Hoover down before his condition became public knowledge, needed a victory so overwhelming that his inevitable death would not fracture the Legion into warring factions. The dam represented validation of everything he believed about strength and destiny, proof that his Neo-Roman Empire could defeat the soft democracy of the NCR and claim the wasteland through superior will and tactical brilliance. Into this powder keg of competing ambitions walked the courier, the variable that none of the major players had adequately accounted for. By the time the battle began, the courier had become the most powerful piece on the board, despite never seeking that power. They had influence with all factions, access to resources and information that should have been restricted, the ability to tip the balance through choices that would be made in real time as the fighting unfolded. Whether they supported House's vision of independent Vegas, the NCR's democratic expansion, Caesar's brutal conquest, or chose to claim power for themselves using Yes Man and the stolen platinum chip, their decision would determine the future of everyone who lived in the Mojave. The battle itself was carnage, measured in hundreds of lives, strategy buried under the chaos of combat, where plans dissolved the moment first contact with the enemy occurred. NCR Rangers and Legion Centurions clashed on the dam's roadway, both sides convinced of inevitable victory, both sides discovering that certainty was the first casualty of actual warfare. Securitrons rolled into combat, their weapon systems upgraded or not depending on who controlled the platinum chip, their loyalty directed by whoever had managed to seize control of House's network. Artillery thundered from both sides of the Colorado River, shells turning concrete and human flesh into abstract art that would take weeks to fully clean from the dam structure. But beneath the tactical movements and strategic objectives, beneath the grand narratives about civilization and democracy and strength through conquest, the battle was really about finishing something Benny had started when he decided that being second in command was insufficient for his ambitions. His betrayal had forced House to react. had drawn the courier into conflicts they would have otherwise avoided, had accelerated timelines that all factions had been carefully managing. The power vacuum created by his actions, the uncertainty about who controlled what resources, the wild card element of a person who had literally come back from the dead, all of these factors transformed what might have been a more controlled confrontation into absolute chaos, where anything could happen. Some version of the battle saw the NCR victorious, their superior numbers and artillery support overwhelming Legion tactics that worked better in open desert than on a narrow dam where there was no room to maneuver. They would claim Hoover Dam, secure the power and water it generated, and trumpet their victory as proof that democracy could triumph over tyranny even in the wasteland. But the cost would be measured in body bags shipped back to California, in a Pyrrhic victory that strained already fragile public support for continued expansion, in the knowledge that holding the dam was very different from actually controlling the Mojave. Other timelines saw Caesar's Legion break through NCR defenses, their fanatical devotion to conquest overcoming superior firepower through sheer willingness to die for their cause. They would enslave the survivors, crucify the officers, and claim the dam as proof that their philosophy of strength was superior to the NCR's soft reliance on technology and democratic weakness. But Caesar's victory would be incomplete, his death from the tumor coming shortly after, leaving the Legion to fracture under leaders who lacked his charisma and vision. The conquest would succeed, but the empire it built would begin dying the moment its founder stopped breathing. In some realities, House emerged victorious. His upgraded Securitron army, sweeping both the NCR and Legion from the dam with mechanical efficiency. He would finally have the military force necessary to impose his vision on the Mojave, turning Vegas into an independent power that could dictate terms to both major factions. But House's victory would come with the bitter knowledge that his most trusted lieutenant had betrayed him, that 200 years of careful planning had nearly been destroyed by someone who had grown up wearing the boots of murder victims. The psychological wound would never fully heal, would leave House even more paranoid and controlling than before. And in the strangest timeline of all, the courier seized control using Yes Man and the Platinum Chip, exactly as Benny had planned, except with themselves in the starring role. They would claim the dam, the Strip, and the Mojave for an independent New Vegas free from both NCR bureaucracy and Legion brutality. It was Benny's dream realized by the person he had tried to kill, poetic justice of a sort that the wasteland specialized in delivering. The courier would rule as Benny never could, having earned power through survival rather than stolen it through betrayal, having paid the price in blood and suffering that Benny had tried to avoid. Regardless of which faction claimed victory, regardless of how the tactical situation resolved, one truth remained constant across all possible outcomes. Benny's ghost haunted the battle even if his physical body was already dead and buried or escaped into distant wasteland. Every decision that led to the second battle traced back in some way to that night in Good Springs, when he had looked at a courier, seen an obstacle to his ambitions, and pulled a trigger that seemed to solve a problem. The bullet had solved nothing. It had created everything. The war, the deaths, the reshaping of the Mojave's political landscape. All of it flowed from that single act of violence that was supposed to be clean and simple and final. The courier stood somewhere, on or near the dam, as the battle raged, making choices that Benny would never get to make, wielding power that he had dreamed about but never touched. In that moment, they understood something that Benny had never grasped, despite all his cunning and planning. Power was not something you took. It was something the wasteland gave you because it needed someone capable of bearing the weight without breaking. Benny had been clever but not strong, ambitious but not wise, capable of seeing opportunities, but incapable of understanding consequences that extended beyond immediate advantage. The fighting eventually stopped. because all fighting eventually stops, either through decisive victory or mutual exhaustion. Bodies were counted, territory was claimed, and the Mojave began the slow process of adapting to whatever new order had emerged from the chaos. The dam continued generating power, water continued flowing to settlements that depended on it, and life in the wasteland continued because life always continued, unless you were actually dead, rather than merely wounded. The second battle would be remembered as the moment when the Mojave's future was determined, when competing visions for civilization clashed, and one emerged victorious or at least dominant enough to impose its will on the region. But historians and storytellers, those few who bothered documenting wasteland events for audiences who might someday care, they would look back at the battle and trace its origins to a man in a checkered suit who had tried to steal destiny and instead become a cautionary tale. Benny wanted immortality through power, wanted to be remembered as the man who liberated Vegas from House's control and built something greater. Instead, he became the man who started a war by shooting the wrong person, who destabilized a region through ambition, unchecked by wisdom, who proved that cleverness, without understanding, was just another way to die badly in a world that killed the clever and stupid with equal efficiency. The sun set over Hoover Dam the way it had set for 2 centuries, indifferent to human ambitions and human suffering, painting the sky in colors that would have been beautiful if they were not caused by radiation still lingering from pre-war nuclear strikes. The bodies were removed. The blood was washed away by Colorado River water that had seen worse, and the wasteland absorbed another battle into its long history of violence and survival. Benny's story was finished, however it had ended, concluded in ways he had not predicted, and probably would not have chosen if given the option. But the wasteland did not offer options. It offered only consequences, and those consequences rippled forward into a future that would be shaped by his actions long after his name was forgotten by everyone except those who had reason to remember. Years passed the way. Years always passed in the Mojave, measured more by survival than calendars, more by scars than celebrations. The battle became history, then legend, then the kind of story travelers told around campfires when conversation turned to the moments when everything changed. New crises emerged to replace old ones. New threats appeared to challenge whoever had claimed victory at the dam. New ambitious people plotted schemes that would probably fail in familiar ways. The wasteland moved forward because that was its nature, constant churning motion that created and destroyed with equal enthusiasm, caring nothing for human preferences about which direction that motion should take. But in the casinos along the strip, in the bars where traders gathered to exchange gossip along with goods, in the quiet moments when old soldiers reflected on battles they had survived, people still told stories about Benny. The details changed depending on who was telling the story and what moral they wanted to extract. Some versions painted him as a villain, pure ambition without redeeming qualities, a traitor who got exactly what he deserved. Other versions were more sympathetic, saw him as a product of brutal circumstances trying to claw his way to something better, a tragic figure whose reach exceeded his grasp in ways that proved fatal. The truth, as truth often was in the wasteland, sat somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, where easy judgments dissolved into complexity that defied simple categorization. Benny had been shaped by growing up in the Bootriders, by learning that survival required being harder and smarter than everyone trying to kill you. House had refined him, given him tools and opportunities that tribal life never would have provided, but had also created the ceiling that Benny spent years staring at with increasing frustration. The platinum chip had offered a way through that ceiling, but only if he was willing to betray the man who had saved him from tribal obscurity. The choice he made in that moment defined everything that came after. cascade of consequences that eventually brought down an entire region into war. The checkered suit became an artifact of sorts, physical evidence that Benny had existed and left an impact on the world. Some said it hung in the Tops casino, preserved behind glass as a memorial to hubris and ambition. Others claimed the courier had taken it, wore it as a trophy or a reminder, or simply because it was a nice suit, and nice things were rare in the wasteland. A few swore they had seen someone matching Benny's description in distant settlements, the story that he had escaped and was living quiet life far from Vegas, under a different name with different hair. The wasteland loved these ambiguous endings, refused to provide closure, because closure was a luxury that implied the universe cared enough about human stories to wrap them up neatly. What was certain, what could not be disputed by anyone who had been present for the events, was that Benny had changed the Mojave through his actions, not in the way he intended, not by becoming the new king of Vegas who ruled with vision that exceeded House's cautious control, but through the chaos he created, through the war he accidentally started, through the courier he accidentally empowered by shooting them in the head and leaving them to die. The region after the second battle was fundamentally different from the region before, shaped by conflicts that traced back to one man's decision that he deserved more than the wasteland had given him. Children born after the battle, growing up in whatever new order had emerged from the chaos, heard stories about the man in the checkered suit without fully understanding the context. To them, Benny was mythology rather than history, a character in a morality tale about ambition and betrayal and the importance of understanding consequences before taking irreversible actions. The parents telling these stories rarely mentioned that Benny had started as a tribal savage, that his rise to power had been its own kind of success story before the betrayal destroyed everything. Redemption arcs were complicated, and children preferred simple narratives where good guys won and bad guys got what they deserved. But older wastelanders, those who had lived through the transition and remembered what Vegas had been before House, and what it became after, they understood Benny in ways that younger generations never would. They remembered the boot riders, remembered when tribes controlled the Mojave through violence that made the second battle look civilized by comparison. They remembered House arriving with his robots and his vision, forcibly transforming savages into casino managers, imposing order on chaos through superior technology and refusal to accept that the old world was truly dead. And they remembered Benny, the one who had embraced that transformation most completely, who had become more civilized than his tribal origins suggested was possible, who had then used all that civilized learning to plan the most savage betrayal imaginable. The Lucky 38 Tower still dominated the Vegas skyline, whether House remained inside or whether someone else had claimed his throne. The structure was monument to pre-war excess and post-war determination, physical proof that humanity could rebuild if it had the will and resources and vision required. Benny had looked at that tower every day for years, had seen it as symbol of everything he wanted and everything that was denied to him by accident of timing and position. His desire to claim it had been understandable, even if his methods were not. The natural ambition of someone capable who saw themselves forced into permanent subordinate role. The grave outside Good Springs remained unmarked, or perhaps it had been marked by someone who knew the full story and wanted to commemorate the spot where everything changed. Travelers sometimes stopped there, paying respects or satisfying curiosity, or simply taking a break from the long walk between settlements. Most had no idea what had happened in that cemetery. No knowledge that the empty plot had once held someone who refused to stay dead, whose survival had altered the trajectory of an entire region. The wasteland kept its secrets well, revealed them only to those who knew where to look and what questions to ask. Some nights, When the wind blew across the Mojave in that particular way that made radiation storms visible on the horizon, people swore they could hear the echo of a gunshot from Goodsprings' direction. Logic said it was imagination, minds creating patterns from random noise, the human tendency to find meaning in chaos. But the wasteland operated on rules that included but extended beyond logic, and who could say with certainty what sounds persisted after the violence that created them had long since faded? The gunshot that started everything might still be echoing, bouncing between mountains, refusing to dissipate, because the consequences it triggered remained unfinished business in the cosmic accounting that governed cause and effect. Benny would never know how he was remembered, would never understand that his attempt to become powerful had instead made him legendary. The distinction mattered because power was temporal, limited to the lifetime of whoever wielded it, while legends persisted as long as someone bothered telling the story. He had wanted to reshape the wasteland, and in the most ironic way possible, he had succeeded, not through the platinum chip, not through controlling the Securitron army, but through the story of his attempt and failure, the cautionary tale that would be told and retold until the details blurred into mythology and the actual facts became irrelevant compared to the moral lesson extracted from them. The moral, if there was one beyond simple survival advice, seemed to be that the wasteland gave you what you earned through suffering rather than what you stole through cleverness. Benny had been clever, perhaps the cleverest person in Vegas during his time managing the Tops Casino, but cleverness had proven insufficient for the task he had set himself, had actually made things worse by giving him confidence that his plans would work despite all the variables he could not control. The courier had not been clever in the same way, had simply been stubborn, resilient, unwilling to accept death when death seemed like the easier option. That stubbornness had proven more valuable than all of Benny's planning. The Mojave night settled over the wasteland like a blanket woven from darkness and possibility. The same night that had witnessed Benny's betrayal, now witnessing the world that betrayal had created. Stars burned overhead, their light traveling from distances so vast that the photons arriving tonight had started their journey before the bombs fell, before Vegas became ruins, before House began his 2-century project of resurrection. Those stars would continue burning long after everyone involved in the second battle had died and been forgotten, would witness whatever new civilizations emerged from wasteland, brutality, or whatever final extinction event ended humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. But for now, in this moment between what had been and what was becoming, the story of Benny remained fresh enough to still mean something to people who had lived through it. The checkered suit, whether displayed in a casino or worn by someone else or buried in a grave somewhere, represented a moment when ambition met consequence and discovered they were incompatible. The platinum chip, wherever it had ended up, represented the idea that pre-war technology could still reshape the post-war world if placed in the right or wrong hands depending on perspective. And the courier, whatever choices they had made, whatever path they had chosen, represented the truth that the wasteland created its own heroes and villains based on criteria that made sense only to those who had survived long enough to understand the rules. Benny's legend would fade eventually, replaced by newer stories about newer ambitious people, making newer mistakes that felt original, despite being variations on themes as old as human civilization. The wasteland would continue grinding forward, creating and destroying, offering opportunities and taking lives, indifferent to whether anyone learned from past failures, or was doomed to repeat them with slight variations in costume and dialogue. But for those who had been there, who had watched Benny rise and fall, who had seen how one bullet in a cemetery could trigger a war that killed hundreds and reshaped a region, the lesson was clear even if uncomfortable. You could be clever, You could be ambitious. You could plan perfect crimes and brilliant betrayals, but the wasteland cared nothing for your plans. It cared only whether you could survive what you started, whether you could adapt when variables you had not predicted entered the equation, whether you understood that taking the first step toward power meant accepting that you might fall from heights that would kill you on impact. Benny had taken that step without fully understanding the commitment it required. He had shot a courier, stolen a chip, betrayed a benefactor, and set in motion forces that destroyed him before he could enjoy even a moment of the power he craved. That was his legend. That was his warning. That was the story the Mojave would tell until something more dramatic came along to replace it. The desert stretched toward horizons that promised nothing but more desert, more struggle, more opportunities to prove you were tough enough to keep breathing when everything conspired to stop your heart. Somewhere in that vastness, bones were scattered that had once belonged to people with dreams as big as Benny's, with schemes as clever, with ambitions as consuming. The wasteland had taken them all, patient and thorough, sorting survivors from corpses with logic that felt random but followed patterns invisible to those who had not lived long enough to recognize them. Benny had joined that collection, his bones or his living exile both confirming the same fundamental truth. The Mojave gave nothing freely. It took everything eventually, and the only question that mattered was whether you would be remembered afterward as someone who tried and failed, or someone who tried and succeeded just long enough to discover that success was itself another kind of failure measured in loneliness and paranoia, and the knowledge that someone cleverer was always plotting your downfall. The story ended, not with resolution, but with the acknowledgement that stories in the wasteland never truly ended, just paused between chapters, while new characters prepared to repeat old mistakes with fresh enthusiasm. Benny was gone. However, that departure had been accomplished, but his presence lingered like radiation in soil, invisible but potent, shaping outcomes for people who would never know his name. That was immortality in the wasteland, not the kind poets celebrated, but the kind that mattered, influence persisting beyond death or defeat. Ripples spreading outward until they became waves that crashed against shores you never intended to reach. He had wanted to control the Mojave. Instead, he had become part of its foundation. One more layer of tragedy and ambition compressed under the weight of consequences into something that future builders would construct their own dreams upon, without recognizing what lay beneath. The wind kept blowing. The radiation kept glowing, and the wasteland kept its counsel about whether any of it meant anything beyond the basic fact that some people survived long enough to have stories told about them while others died anonymously in dirt that would never give them up. Benny had gotten his story, had become legend, had achieved the kind of lasting impact that most wastelanders could only dream about between moments of desperate survival. Whether he would have considered that a victory or a defeat was a question only he could answer, and he was no longer available for comment. The Mojave wasteland teaches lessons to those willing to learn and kills those who refuse the education. One lesson towers above all others in importance, carved not in stone but in the scattered remains of people who believed they were exceptional enough to ignore basic truth. The lesson is this: every plan contains the seeds of its own destruction. Every scheme creates enemies faster than it creates allies, and the gap between ambition and capability is measured in unmarked graves scattered across a desert that remembers nothing and forgives nothing. Benny thought he understood this lesson, thought his tribal origins and years surviving House's court had taught him everything necessary about navigating wasteland politics. He had watched the strong devour the weak in boot-rider camps, had studied how House maintained control through technology and careful manipulation, had learned from both experiences that power flowed to those who could see opportunities invisible to others. His mistake was believing that understanding these patterns made him immune to them, that being clever about the game meant the game could not destroy him the way it destroyed everyone else who played without adequate respect for consequences. The platinum chip represents a particular kind of wasteland tragedy, the pre-war technology that promises salvation but delivers only new forms of damnation. House had waited 2 centuries for that chip, had built an entire empire on the assumption that it would eventually return to him and complete his vision for Vegas. The chip was not just circuitry and programming, it was hope crystallized into physical form. The belief that pre-war genius could solve post-war problems if only the right tools could be recovered from ruins. Benny had stolen that hope, had literally shot someone to take it, had gambled everything on the belief that possessing the chip would transform him from lieutenant to king. But hope in the wasteland was always poisonous, always contaminated by the radiation that soaked into everything and made even good intentions carcinogenic. The chip did not make Benny powerful. It made him a target, drew the attention of every faction that understood what it represented, forced him into decisions that accelerated his downfall rather than preventing it. The courier tracked him because of the chip. House turned against him because of the chip. Caesar imprisoned him because of the chip. The object that was supposed to grant ultimate power instead became an anchor that dragged him down toward destruction he might have avoided if he had just stayed in his lane and accepted being second in command to an immortal genius. The question that haunts Benny's story, the question that anyone examining his choices must eventually confront, is whether he ever really had a choice at all. His tribal origins had taught him that survival required taking what you needed before someone else took it from you. House had reinforced that lesson while dressing it in civilized language about ambition and vision and the importance of being exceptional. The wasteland itself punished passivity, killed those who waited for permission or fairness or the right moment. Everything in Benny's life had taught him that hesitation was death, that you either reached for power or you died powerless, that moral considerations were luxuries that got people killed in a world where every day was a struggle against entropy and violence. Perhaps he was always going to betray House, not because of any flaw in his character, but because the character had been shaped by experiences that made betrayal seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. Perhaps shooting the courier was always going to happen, not because Benny was evil, but because the wasteland had taught him that loose ends were more dangerous than murder. Perhaps his entire story was deterministic from the moment the boot riders knelt before House's Securitrons, young Benny learning that the powerful could reshape the world, while the weak merely survived in whatever shape the powerful imposed. But the wasteland also taught another lesson, one that Benny apparently never learned despite all his cleverness and observation. The lesson was that determinism was itself an illusion, that every moment offered choices, even if those choices were constrained by circumstances beyond control. The courier could have stayed dead, should have stayed dead based on medical probability and wasteland logic. But they chose to dig out of that grave, chose to track Benny across the Mojave, chose to become the variable that destroyed his careful plans. That choice was not inevitable. It was an act of will so pure and stubborn that it bent probability in directions probability was not supposed to bend. Benny never understood that kind of will because his own will was always tactical, always calculated based on advantage and disadvantage, always filtered through the question of what served his interests. The courier's will was different, simpler, more fundamental. They had been wronged and they refused to accept that wrong as permanent condition. The philosophical implications were profound in ways that Benny would have recognized if he had bothered to think beyond his own schemes. The wasteland was not actually deterministic. It was responsive to human will when that will was strong enough to impose itself on chaos. Benny had will, but he lacked the kind of absolute commitment that transformed will into destiny-bending force. The tragedy of his story is not that he failed, but that he failed while possessing all the tools necessary for success, except one. He had intelligence, charisma, understanding of power structures, access to resources, and opportunity provided by circumstances that aligned in his favor. What he lacked was the wisdom to recognize that stealing power was fundamentally different from earning it, that controlling the Securitron army would not make him a leader any more than stealing House's clothes would make him a visionary. Power without legitimacy was just violence waiting to be overthrown by the next person clever enough to see the vulnerabilities that cleverness always created. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam would have happened eventually, regardless of Benny's actions. The NCR and Legion II committed to their collision course for any individual to prevent. But the specific form that battle took, the wild card elements that made prediction impossible, the courier's involvement as a factor that could tip the balance toward any faction or claim power for themselves, all of that traced back to Benny's betrayal. He wanted to be the man who changed the Mojave, and he succeeded, just not in any way he would have chosen or anticipated. The checkered suit, hanging in a casino, or worn by someone else, or buried with his corpse, serves as memorial to the idea that style can substitute for substance only until tested by actual crisis. Benny had perfected the appearance of civilization, the smooth talk and expensive clothes and casino boss persona that made him seem like he belonged in pre-war Vegas rather than post-war wasteland. But appearances were costumes, and when the costume was stripped away by circumstances that demanded substance, what remained was a tribal savage who had learned new words for old impulses, but had never transcended the fundamental belief that taking was the same as deserving. The wasteland will continue producing people like Benny as long as it exists. Clever survivors who look at the gap between where they are and where they want to be and decide that the fastest route between those points is betrayal and theft. Some will succeed where he failed, will time their moves better, or choose softer targets, or simply get luckier with variables they cannot control. Others will fail worse than he did, will die more quickly and more painfully, will be forgotten more completely. But all of them will be, in some essential way, repeating his story, reaching for power they have not earned through suffering, believing that cleverness is the same as wisdom. And the wasteland will keep teaching its lesson to each new generation of ambitious fools who believe they are exceptional enough to ignore it. The lesson is simple, brutal, and absolutely accurate. You can take what you want, but you will pay for it with interest compounded over time until the debt crushes you. You can betray those who trust you, but betrayal creates enemies who will dedicate everything to your destruction. You can shoot people who inconvenience you, but some of them will refuse to stay dead and will come for you with the unstoppable force of consequences, delayed but never canceled. Benny paid his debt in the fort, or in the arena, or on a cross, or in exile, or through execution in a tent where tyrants played at philosophy. However it happened, whatever specific form his downfall took, the payment was complete and final. The man who wanted to be king became the man who was shot by someone he had shot first, or beaten by people he had tried to use, or destroyed by systems he had tried to manipulate. The cosmic accounting balanced, and the universe moved on to newer imbalances that would eventually require their own corrections. The story endures not because Benny was exceptional, but because he was representative, the perfect embodiment of wasteland ambition in all its intelligence and foolishness and inevitable tragedy. Every wastelander who has ever dreamed of being more than they are, every survivor who has looked at power and hungered for it, every clever person who has believed that rules apply to others but not to themselves, they all see something of themselves in Benny's story. That recognition is what transforms his individual failure into universal cautionary tale. The Mojave Desert spreads under stars that care nothing for human drama, has spread under those same stars since long before the bombs fell, and will spread under them long after the last human in the wasteland has returned to dust. The desert remembers nothing because memory requires caring, and caring requires investment, and the desert is invested only in its own existence. Benny walked across that desert dreaming dreams of power and woke up to nightmares of consequence. The desert noted his passage the way it noted every other passage, with absolute indifference, and when he was gone it closed over the space he had occupied like water closing over a stone thrown into deep water. But humans are not deserts. Not yet. Not entirely. Humans remember and tell stories and extract meaning from chaos. Even when chaos protests, that meaning is an illusion imposed by minds desperate to find patterns. The story of the man in the checkered suit who shot a hero and started a war will be told as long as there are people in the Mojave who remember the second battle, who lived through the chaos and survived to tell about it. And perhaps that is the only immortality worth having in a world where immortality in any traditional sense died with the pre-war civilization that believed in monuments and legacy and the importance of being remembered. Benny wanted to be remembered as a king. He will be remembered as a warning. Close enough for wasteland work. Close enough for a world where close counts. Because nothing is ever perfect, and perfection would probably be fatal anyway. The checkered suit, the platinum chip, the grave in Good Springs, the battle at the dam, all of it connects into a story about ambition, meeting consequence, and discovering they were never going to be friends. That story is the Mojave in microcosm, is the wasteland teaching its eternal lesson one more time, to an audience that will probably ignore it, because humans always ignore warnings, until those warnings become personal in ways that make ignoring them impossible. The wind blows across graves, marked and unmarked, across monuments to hubris and shrines to survival, across the entire vast expanse of a desert that has seen everything and been impressed by nothing. Somewhere in that wind is the echo of a gunshot, or maybe just the memory of an echo, or maybe nothing but radiation-warmed air creating sounds that human brains interpret as meaningful. Benny's ghost walks the Mojave, if ghosts exist, and if they care enough about the living to bother haunting. But probably there are no ghosts and no haunting, just consequences that persist after the people who created them have stopped being people and become whatever comes after. The story ends where all wasteland stories end, with survival or death, with power claimed or lost, with lessons learned or ignored, with the desert stretching on forever toward horizons that promise nothing and deliver exactly that. Benny tried to cheat the desert, tried to impose his will on a place that recognized no will but its own, and the desert corrected that misconception with the thoroughness that deserts bring to all corrections. What remains is not the man, but the story, not the ambition, but the warning, not the dream of power, but the documentation of what happens when dreams meet reality, in a place where reality has teeth and dreams have no protection. The Mojave keeps its secrets, including this one, including the true final fate of a man who wanted to be king and became legend instead. The years that followed the second battle brought change to the Mojave in forms both obvious and subtle, transformations that reshaped the physical landscape while leaving psychological scars that would take generations to heal, if they ever healed at all. Whoever claimed victory at Hoover Dam inherited not a prize but a responsibility, discovered that controlling territory was fundamentally different from understanding what to do with that control once established. The NCR brought bureaucracy and corruption in equal measure, forms to fill out while supply lines collapsed and soldiers died from preventable causes. The Legion brought order through terror, peace purchased at the cost of every freedom that made peace worth having. House brought vision constrained by paranoia, genius hobbled by the inability to trust anyone after the betrayal that had nearly destroyed everything he had built over 2 centuries. And if the courier claimed power for themselves using Benny's stolen plans and the reprogrammed yes man, they discovered that independence was another word for isolation. That ruling without the infrastructure of established government meant solving every problem personally until exhaustion or assassination ended their reign. No outcome was perfect because the wasteland did not produce perfection, only varying degrees of functional dysfunction that kept people alive long enough to reproduce problems that would kill their children or grandchildren. The battle had determined who held power, but power itself remained exactly as corrupted and corrupting as it had always been, just wearing different uniforms and speaking different languages of justification. The casinos on the Strip continued operating because gambling was one of the few industries that thrived, regardless of who controlled the political apparatus surrounding it. People needed escape from wasteland brutality, needed to believe that luck could change circumstances that skill and effort had failed to improve, needed the illusion that chance rather than systemic inequality determined who prospered and who struggled. The Tops Casino stood among the others, its Art Deco facade maintained by robot labor or human workers, depending on who had won the battle and what economic system they had imposed. Inside, the slot machines rang with the same synthetic enthusiasm they had displayed for decades, indifferent to ownership changes and political upheaval, existing only to separate desperate people from caps they could not afford to lose. The penthouse suite, where Benny had lived and schemed, remained as he had left it, or was stripped clean and repurposed, or became a museum dedicated to cautionary tales about ambition exceeding capability. The specific fate mattered less than the fact that the space existed as reminder of presence now absent. Ghost story. Location. For a ghost that may or may not have been created, depending on whether consciousness persisted after death, and whether Benny's consciousness would choose to haunt the place of his greatest triumph, an ultimate failure. Late-night casino workers swore they sometimes heard movement in that suite. Footsteps crossing empty floors, the sound of someone pacing while plotting schemes that would never come to fruition. Logic said the sounds were air circulation systems, settling foundations, normal building noises, magnified by imagination, and the human tendency to create narrative from random sensory input. But the wasteland operated according to rules that included but transcended logic. And who could say with absolute certainty that the dead stayed dead rather than lingering in places where their ambitions had burned hottest? Benny had wanted the Tops Casino, had wanted Vegas, had wanted power that would reshape the Mojave according to vision only he possessed. Perhaps that wanting was strong enough to persist beyond whatever ending he had met, echo continuing long after the source of the sound had been silenced. The grave outside Goodsprings became a landmark for travelers who knew the story, a pilgrimage site for those who believed that understanding the past could somehow inform the present or prevent the future from repeating the same mistakes in slightly different forms. Someone had erected a marker at some point, simple wooden cross or metal sign or pile of rocks arranged to suggest human intentionality rather than natural randomness. The marker did not bear Benny's name because this was not his grave, though his story began here as surely as if he had been the one buried in shallow earth. This was the courier's grave, the place where death had been attempted and refused, where the variable that destroyed all carefully laid plans had clawed its way back to life through sheer stubborn refusal to accept the universe's verdict. Visitors stood at that grave and tried to imagine what it had been like. The moment of being shot and buried, and then somehow surviving to change everything. The imagination failed because some experiences existed beyond the reach of empathy, required actual lived horror to understand, rather than intellectual reconstruction from safe distance. But the attempt to imagine was itself meaningful, acknowledgement that the story mattered, that this anonymous plot of disturbed Earth represented a turning point, not just for individuals involved, but for the entire region they inhabited. One grave, one bullet, one person refusing to die. Everything else flowed from those simple facts, like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance until momentum built into force that carved canyons through landscape that thought itself permanent. The great Khans who had participated in the ambush mostly died in the years following, casualties of wasteland violence that had nothing to do with Benny or the Platinum Chip or any of the grand political movements that swept across the Mojave. They died in raids that went wrong, from chems that were too pure or too contaminated, from internal tribal politics that turned violent the way tribal politics always eventually did. A few survived and told stories about the night they had helped a casino boss murder a courier, described how professional the whole operation had seemed, how impossible it was to predict that the body would refuse to stay dead and would hunt them all down either directly or through the chaos their survival created. The survivors carried guilt or indifference depending on individual psychology, but all of them understood that they had been present for a moment that mattered, had stood in the graveyard when history pivoted on events too small to recognize as important, until much later, when perspective allowed proper evaluation. The Platinum Chip itself ended up in various hands depending on which timeline had manifested, which choices had been made during the crucial hours when everything hung in balance. House reclaimed it and used it to upgrade his Securitron army, achieving the military supremacy he had planned for 2 centuries. Caesar took it and died before understanding its full potential, leaving the chip as artifact in Legion possession that they lacked technical knowledge to utilize. The NCR seized it and shipped it back to California, where bureaucrats argued about its strategic value while it sat in a warehouse waiting for committee approval that would never come. The courier kept it, either as trophy or tool, reminder of how much blood had been spilled over a piece of pre-war technology that was ultimately less important than the choices people made in its presence. Regardless of physical location, the chip's symbolic power persisted beyond its practical applications. It represented the idea that the old world could still reach forward and reshape the new one. That pre-war genius contained solutions to post-war problems, if only the right artifacts could be recovered and deployed by people wise enough to understand them. But the chip also represented hubris, the belief that technology could substitute for wisdom, that having superior tools meant you deserved to wield power over those with inferior equipment. Benny had believed in that hubris, had staked everything on the assumption that possessing the chip would transform him from lieutenant to king. His failure suggested that the chip's real power was not in what it did, but in what it revealed about the people who fought to control it. New Vegas continued evolving after the battle, either flowering into greater prosperity or declining into managed decay depending on who controlled it and what vision they imposed. The city that House had resurrected from nuclear ruins remained the brightest spot in the Mojave, literal beacon of light visible for miles across dark desert, promised that civilization could be rebuilt if you were willing to accept whatever compromises that rebuilding required. But brightness always cast shadows, and in those shadows lived everyone the city had no use for. The poor and desperate and broken who serviced the economy without participating in its rewards. The contrast between the Strip's neon glory and Freeside's desperate poverty remained stark regardless of political changes, suggesting that inequality was feature rather than bug in any system humans constructed to organize themselves. The other casino bosses who had been Benny's peers processed his absence in ways that reflected their individual relationships and rivalries. Some felt relief that a potential competitor had been eliminated. One less ambitious person scheming for advantage in zero-sum environment where everyone's success came at someone else's expense. Others felt fear, recognition that if Benny could fall despite all his cleverness and preparation, then no one was truly safe from the consequences of playing power games in a place where power was only ever temporarily held before being violently transferred to someone else. A few felt something approaching grief. Not for Benny specifically, but for what his failure represented about the impossibility of escaping the roles the wasteland assigned, regardless of how much you transformed yourself or how desperately you wanted something different. The tribal past that Benny had tried so hard to escape, and then to transcend, continued haunting the Mojave in forms he would have recognized despite the civilized costumes they wore. The fundamental dynamics remained unchanged from his days in the Boot Riders. The strong still preyed on the weak when they could get away with it. Loyalty still meant nothing beyond immediate tactical advantage. Trust still got people killed by those they trusted. Violence still resolved disputes that negotiation left ambiguous. House had tried to impose order on that chaos through technology and vision, had partially succeeded in creating spaces where different rules applied, but the chaos waited just outside the Securitron patrols, patient and hungry, ready to reclaim any territory that momentarily lacked sufficient force to defend it. Perhaps that was Benny's real legacy, not the war he started, or the betrayal he attempted, but the demonstration that you could never truly leave behind what shaped you. He had transformed from tribal savage to casino boss, had adopted new clothes and new vocabulary and new methods, but underneath the transformation, the core remained fundamentally unchanged. The boy who had watched Boot Riders kill each other over salvage had become the man who shot a courier for a platinum chip. Same philosophy of taking what you wanted before someone else took it from you. Same belief that hesitation was weakness and mercy was luxury. The packaging had changed, but the product remained identical. Violence and ambition dressed in suits, expensive enough to make people forget what they were looking at until too late to matter. The Mojave Express, the courier company whose employee had been murdered and buried in that Good Springs grave, continued operating after the battle because package delivery remained necessary regardless of political circumstances. They modified their routes to account for new territorial boundaries, adjusted their rates to reflect changed risk calculations, hired new couriers to replace those killed by raiders or radiation or the 1,000 other hazards that made the profession one of the most dangerous in the wasteland. The company remembered what had happened to their employee, kept records that documented the crime and its eventual resolution, but memory was not the same as justice, and justice was not the same as prevention. Future couriers would be murdered for valuable packages they carried. Future shallow graves would be dug. Future survivors would crawl back toward life, or fail to crawl and become statistics in reports that no one read carefully enough to learn from. That continuity, that grinding repetition of patterns that everyone recognized but no one seemed capable of interrupting. That was perhaps the truest tragedy of Benny's story, and the war it triggered. Nothing fundamental had changed, despite all the violence and sacrifice. Power had transferred from one set of hands to another, but power itself remained exactly as corrupted and corrupting as always. The wasteland continued killing people through direct violence and slow attrition. Ambition continued driving individuals to take risks that destroyed them, and the next Benny was already out there somewhere, growing up in some tribal camp or settlement, learning the wrong lessons from harsh experience. preparing to repeat the same mistakes in ways that would feel original until distance and perspective revealed them as just another variation on ancient theme. The wind that blew across the Mojave carried dust that had once been people, tribal warriors, and NCR soldiers, and Legion slavers, and independent survivors, all reduced to particles that the desert scattered democratically, without regard for the allegiances or philosophies they had held while alive. That dust settled on the grave markers and casino floors, and weapons and water supplies, physical reminder that everyone ended up as undifferentiated material, regardless of how important they had believed themselves during the brief interval between birth and death. Benny was or would become part of that dust. His molecular structure dispersed across territory he had wanted to rule, achieving through decomposition the spread and influence that had eluded him, while his molecules maintained coherent form. The stars overhead continued their ancient patterns, constellations that pre-war humanity had named and narrativized, imposing meaning on random arrangements of distant fusion reactions. Those stars would outlast the wasteland, would continue burning long after the last human had died, and the planet had healed or remained poisoned, indifferent to whether intelligence persisted in the universe, or entropy claimed everything. Benny had looked at those stars from his penthouse window, had made wishes or plans or calculations while starlight fell on his upturned face. The stars had not cared then and did not care now, had witnessed his rise and fall with the same absolute indifference they brought to witnessing supernovas and planet formation, and the heat death of galaxies. But humans were not stars, not yet evolved or devolved to that level of transcendent indifference. Humans cared because caring was what humans did, the defining characteristic that made them human, rather than just another species competing for resources and environment, designed to kill anything too slow or too weak or too unlucky. The people who remembered Benny cared about his story because it was their story too, because they recognized themselves in his ambitions and his failures and his fundamental inability to escape the patterns that the wasteland imposed on everyone born into its harsh embrace. That recognition made the story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing on to new generations who would probably ignore its lessons but deserve to hear them anyway. The question that haunted everyone who examined Benny's choices with any depth of thought was whether he could have made different decisions at the crucial moments, whether free will existed in any meaningful sense, or whether biology and environment predetermined outcomes with margins so narrow that choice was really just illusion. Consciousness created to make existence bearable. The wasteland suggested determinism, endless cycles of violence and poverty, and desperate survival that repeated regardless of individual efforts to break free. But the courier's survival suggested something else, suggested that will could bend probability when applied with sufficient force, that the universe was not actually closed system, but something stranger and more responsive to human intention than pure materialism allowed. Benny had possessed will, had applied it with focus and intelligence, had made choices that reflected careful calculation rather than random impulse. But his will had been tactical rather than fundamental, always filtered through the question of advantage rather than emerging from deeper philosophical commitment to vision larger than personal advancement. The courier's will was different, simpler, more primal. They had been wronged, and they refused to accept that wrong as permanent feature of reality. That refusal, that bone-deep rejection of injustice, had proven more powerful than all of Benny's clever planning because it came from a place that planning could not access or predict or defend against. The lesson was uncomfortable for anyone who valued intelligence and preparation, suggested that sometimes the universe rewarded stubbornness over cleverness, brute force of refusal over elegant schemes, But the lesson was also consistent with wasteland experience, where survivors tended to be those who kept moving forward when smart people had calculated that forward movement was irrational. The wasteland killed the smart and the stupid equally, but it had special contempt for those who thought they were smart enough to outsmart it, who believed their intelligence granted them immunity from consequences that crushed everyone else. Benny had been smart, and his intelligence had killed him more surely than any bullet or crucifixion or arena combat could have. The Mojave night settled over everything with the weight of finality that was not actually final, just another darkness in the endless cycle of darkness and light that would continue until the sun expanded and consumed the planet, or humanity destroyed itself, or something stranger happened that current understanding could not anticipate. The casinos glowed against that darkness. Artificial light powered by Hoover Dam, or generators, or whatever energy source remained functional enough to keep the illusion alive. The light attracted people the way light always attracted desperate things, moths and humans, both drawn to brightness that promised warmth and delivered only the revelation that warmth, without substance, was just another form of cold. Benny's checkered suit, wherever it existed in physical form or memory, represented the ultimate wasteland fashion statement. Expensive fabric, worn over violent foundation, civilization's costume, draped across savage necessity, style substituting for substance, until crisis stripped away the pretense and revealed what had been there all along. The suit had made Benny look civilized, had probably made him feel civilized. But civilization was not clothing you put on. It was choices you made when no one was watching, constraints you accepted even when violating them would be profitable, values you maintained when abandoning them would be easier. Benny had worn the suit, but had never internalized what it represented, had remained fundamentally tribal while pretending that transformation had occurred. The tragedy was not that he failed, but that he came so close to succeeding that the margin between his ambition and its realization was measured not in light years, but in millimeters, the distance a bullet traveled through brain tissue before hitting bone in a way that failed to kill immediately. If the courier had died as planned, if the shallow grave had been adequate, if infection or blood loss or simple bad luck had finished what the gunshot started, then Benny's plan would have worked. He would have upgraded the Securitron army, would have overthrown House, would have become king of Vegas, and possibly much more. The fact that he came so close made his failure more rather than less tragic, suggested that competence was not enough, and luck was not enough, and clever planning was not enough, unless all of them aligned in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. The desert kept its secrets, including this final one, the answer to whether Benny in his last moments had experienced regret, or defiance, or acceptance, or some emotion for which no word existed, because no one had needed to name it before. The answer died with him, or lived in his exile, inaccessible to historians and storytellers who could only speculate, based on incomplete information and personal biases. Perhaps he died cursing the courier, who had refused to stay dead, blaming his failure on bad luck rather than bad judgment. Perhaps he died understanding exactly where he had gone wrong, achieving in final moments the wisdom that would have saved him if he had possessed it earlier. Perhaps he simply died consciousness ending without poetry or revelation, neural activity stopping the way all neural activity eventually stopped, regardless of philosophical preparation. The story ended where all stories ended in the wasteland, with death or survival or ambiguous states that combined elements of both in ways that made clean categories inadequate for describing lived experience. Benny's story had ended, but the Mojave continued. And somewhere in that continuation was the next person who would try what Benny tried, who would reach for power they had not earned, who would mistake cleverness for wisdom and ambition for qualification. The cycle would repeat, because cycles always repeated in systems where fundamental variables remained unchanged, where violence was still currency and power was still the only thing that mattered, and mercy was still the luxury that got you killed. If you practiced it without adequate force to defend yourself from those who interpreted it as weakness. The checkered suit hung in darkness or light, empty or worn, memorial or utility, depending on perspective and outcome. The platinum chip rested in whatever hands had claimed it, inert or active depending on who controlled it and what they intended. The grave outside Goodsprings waited for the next occupant or remained empty, as testament to the impossibility of keeping dead things buried when they decided they had unfinished business. And the Mojave stretched on forever in all directions, hostile and beautiful, and absolutely indifferent to human drama played out across its ancient surface, caring nothing for Benny or the courier, or House or anyone else who believed themselves important enough to matter, to a desert that had existed before humans walked upright, and would exist long after the last human had returned to component molecules. The wind blew, the radiation glowed, and the wasteland kept its secrets. Some of those secrets were named Benny, and some were named in other ways. But all of them shared the common characteristic of being stories about ambition, meeting consequence in a place where consequence was the only reliable constant in a universe built on variables that refused to be predicted or controlled. That was the final word on Benny's legend, if legends required final words, rather than continuing forever through retelling and reinterpretation and the stubborn human refusal to let important stories die, even when everyone involved had long since turned to dust. The stars kept burning, indifferent and eternal, witnesses to everything and testimony to nothing. The years turned into decades, the way they always did in the wasteland, measured less by calendars than by the accumulation of scars and the fading of memories that had once seemed permanent enough to define entire lifetimes. The people who had lived through the Second Battle of Hoover Dam grew old or died young, their direct experiences replaced by second-hand accounts that mutated with each retelling, until the facts became flexible enough to serve whatever moral lesson the storyteller wanted to extract. Benny's name persisted through those mutations, sometimes as villain, and sometimes as tragic hero, and sometimes as simple cautionary example of what happened when ambition outpaced wisdom in a place where wisdom was the only thing that kept you alive long enough to regret your mistakes. The children who grew up hearing stories about the man in the checkered suit had no personal connection to the events, no visceral understanding of what the Mojave had been like during those crucial years when everything hung in balance. To them, Benny was mythology rather than history, a character in bedtime stories meant to teach lessons about loyalty and betrayal, and the importance of thinking several steps ahead before making irreversible choices. They asked questions their parents could not always answer, wanted to know what Benny had looked like and sounded like, and whether he had been truly evil or just unlucky. The parents did their best, inventing details when memory failed, shaping the story to fit the values they wanted to instill in the next generation. But some of those children grew up to become wastelanders themselves, and wastelanders eventually learned that the stories they had been told as children contained truth, even when the details were fabricated. They learned that ambition was dangerous, that betrayal had consequences that compounded over time, that shooting people to get what you wanted often created more problems than it solved. They learned these lessons through experience, rather than storytelling, paid for them in blood and suffering, and the slow accumulation of regrets that came from surviving situations that killed people who made slightly different choices. And when they learned these lessons, they remembered the stories about Benny, recognized him as someone who had learned the same lessons too late to benefit from the education. The Mojave itself changed in ways both profound and superficial, new buildings rising while old ones collapsed, populations shifting as water sources dried up or were discovered, trade routes redirecting to avoid dangers that had not existed in previous years. But underneath the surface changes, the fundamental character of the region remained constant. It was still a place where survival required hardness, where weakness was punished with death or slavery, where the strong took what they wanted, and the weak accepted whatever scraps remained. House's vision of civilized Vegas, or Caesar's dream of unified empire, or the NCR's aspiration toward democratic expansion. None of them had fundamentally altered that basic reality. They had just provided new frameworks for the same ancient dynamics to express themselves through. The casinos continued their eternal function of separating desperate people from resources they could not afford to lose, promising fortune while delivering statistical inevitability that the house always won in aggregate even when individual gamblers experienced temporary victory. The Tops Casino remained among the most prominent, its reputation enhanced rather than diminished by association with Benny's story. Tourists came specifically to see where he had lived and schemed, to stand in spaces he had occupied, to imagine what it had been like to be so close to absolute power, while simultaneously being observed by the very person you were planning to betray. The casino management encouraged this dark tourism, understood that tragedy sold almost as well as sex and violence, that people were drawn to locations where important events had unfolded even when those events were morally ambiguous at best. Some nights, late after the crowds had thinned, and the serious gamblers had either won enough to quit or lost enough to be ejected, casino workers would gather and tell stories about the old days when Benny had run the Tops. The stories were probably half fiction, memories contaminated by time and wishful thinking, and the very human tendency to make the past more dramatic than it actually was. But the stories served a function beyond historical accuracy. They reminded everyone that power was temporary, that today's king became tomorrow's cautionary tale, that the wasteland consumed the ambitious and comfortable alike with democratic impartiality. Those lessons were worth learning, even if the vehicle for learning them was storytelling that took liberties with facts. The grave outside Goodsprings became something approaching holy site for a particular type of wasteland pilgrim. Those who believed that places absorbed the significance of events that occurred there and radiated that significance back to anyone sensitive enough to perceive it. They came to stand where the courier had been buried and had refused to die, hoping that some of that stubborn resilience would transfer to them through proximity or prayer or whatever mechanism they imagined connected the living to the dead and the past to the present. Most left disappointed, discovering that dirt was just dirt, regardless of what had happened in it, that the universe was not actually magical, despite human desperation for it to be otherwise. But a few left feeling something they could not quite articulate, a sense that the grave mattered in ways that transcended logic or evidence, that standing there meant something even if that meaning could not be reduced to words. Doc Mitchell, the physician who had saved the courier's life through combination of medical skill and wasteland improvisation, eventually died in his sleep, from causes that had nothing to do with violence or radiation or any of the 1,000 dramatic ways people died in the Mojave. His passing was quiet and unremarked, except by the few residents of Goodsprings who had known him, and even they mourned briefly before moving on because extended mourning was luxury the wasteland rarely afforded. But Mitchell's contribution to the story persisted beyond his death. His decision to treat an injured stranger had been the hinge on which the entire future had swung. Without his intervention, the courier dies in Goodsprings and Benny's plan succeeds and the Mojave develops along completely different trajectory. One old doctor's ethical commitment to healing had altered the course of history in ways he probably never fully understood. That randomness. That sense that massive consequences could flow from small decisions made by people who had no idea they were standing at crucial junctures, that was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Benny's story and its aftermath. He had planned so carefully, had accounted for so many variables, had tried to control outcomes through superior intelligence and tactical thinking. But he had failed to account for Doc Mitchell's medical skill, for the courier's unusual resilience, for the specific angle at which the bullet had entered skull, and the specific way that angle had created wound that looked fatal, but was not. Those variables were beyond anyone's ability to predict or control, suggested that the universe operated according to rules that included massive doses of pure randomness, alongside whatever deterministic patterns existed. The philosophical implications were profound for anyone who bothered thinking about them seriously. If Benny's failure came down to bad luck rather than bad planning, then what lesson could be extracted beyond the useless observation that sometimes you got lucky and sometimes you did not? But if his failure came from character flaws or tactical errors, then the story became morally instructive, suggested that making better choices would produce better outcomes. The truth was probably somewhere in between, some combination of luck and planning and character that created outcomes too complex to reduce to simple causation. Benny had made bad choices that bad luck punished more severely than they might have been punished under different circumstances. That seemed like adequate summary, even if it failed to provide the kind of clear moral guidance that people craved from their cautionary tales. The new California Republic, if it had won the battle and held the Mojave, eventually faced the same problems that had always plagued expansionist democracies stretched too thin across too much territory: corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, military overextension, and the fundamental contradiction between democratic ideals and imperial reality. They brought order and law to the region, but the order was uneven, and the law was applied selectively based on who had political connections and who did not. Citizens lived better under NCR rule than they would have under Legion slavery. But better was relative term in a wasteland where the baseline was brutal, regardless of who was in charge. The NCR soldiers who had fought at the dam were celebrated as heroes and then forgotten as new crises emerged to occupy public attention. Their sacrifices remembered in official ceremonies, but not in material support for survivors dealing with physical and psychological wounds that never fully healed. Caesar's legion, if they had achieved victory, imposed their brutal philosophy on the Mojave with the thorough efficiency they brought to all conquests. Slavery, crucifixion, the complete destruction of pre-war culture in favor of bastardized Roman aesthetics that Caesar had cobbled together from half-understood classical texts. The region became orderly in the way that graveyards were orderly, everything in its place because everything was too terrified to move. But Caesar died shortly after the victory, his brain tumor finally claiming him despite the best efforts of wasteland medicine, and the legion fractured exactly as he had feared. Without his charisma to hold disparate tribes together under unified command, the component parts began warring among themselves, each commander believing themselves worthy to inherit the throne. The empire collapsed not from external pressure, but internal contradiction, proving that organizations built around single personality were only ever as stable as that personality's lifespan. Robert House, if he survived and maintained control, achieved something approximating his vision of independent Vegas, free from both NCR and Legion interference. His upgraded Securitron army enforced order on the Strip and surrounding areas. His pre-war genius continued guiding development in directions that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term exploitation. But House never fully recovered from Benny's betrayal, the psychological wound proving more difficult to heal than any physical damage could have been. He became more paranoid, more controlling, more convinced that trusting anyone was invitation to disaster. The Vegas he built was prosperous but cold, efficient but lacking the human element that made prosperity feel like anything more than numbers on terminals and caps in vaults. His vision succeeded on its own terms while failing on terms he had never bothered to consider important. And if the courier claimed power for themselves, using Yes Man and the Platinum Chip to establish independent rule, free from any faction's control, they discovered that being king was very different from wanting to be king. Every decision became their responsibility, every failure their fault, every success merely temporary stay against inevitable entropy. They learned what Benny had never understood, that power isolated you from everyone around you, that the higher you climbed the lonelier the view became, that ruling meant accepting that you would be simultaneously loved and hated by people whose approval or disapproval was completely divorced from your actual performance. Some couriers thrived in that role, grew into leadership, and shaped the Mojave into something genuinely better than what had existed before. Others crumbled under the pressure, became tyrants or hermits, discovered too late that they had fought for prize that destroyed them more effectively than any enemy could have. But all these outcomes, all these possible futures, they shared common origin in the moment when Benny pulled a trigger in Good Springs Cemetery. That moment was the stone thrown into still water, the ripples spreading outward in patterns that touched everything even when the connection was not immediately obvious. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam, the deaths of hundreds or thousands depending on which side you counted, the political reshaping of the entire Mojave region, all of it traced back to one man's ambition and one person's refusal to stay dead when death was the expected outcome. That connection was what made Benny's story worth remembering even as the specific details faded into mythology and legend. The wasteland produced stories constantly, millions of small dramas playing out every day as people struggled to survive or build or destroy or simply exist in an environment that fought them at every turn. Most of those stories were forgotten immediately, died with the people who experienced them, left no mark on the world beyond the physical space their bodies eventually occupied. But some stories persisted, earned through combination of dramatic impact and moral weight, the kind of staying power that transformed them from personal experience into collective mythology. Benny's story had earned that persistence, not because he was exceptional, but because his failure to be exceptional, despite all his efforts, encapsulated something fundamental about wasteland existence. The lesson that eventually crystallized from all the retellings and interpretations was this: the wasteland did not care about your plans. It did not care about your intelligence or your ambition or your carefully calculated schemes. It cared only about whether you could survive what you started, whether you understood that every action created consequences that might not manifest for years, but would eventually manifest with interest compounded over time, whether you possessed the wisdom to recognize when reaching for power would burn your hands beyond healing. Benny had lacked that wisdom, had confused tactical intelligence with strategic understanding, had believed that wanting something badly enough was the same as deserving it. The wasteland had corrected that misunderstanding with the brutal efficiency it brought to all corrections. The stars that had witnessed everything from their vast distance continued burning, fusion reactions converting hydrogen to helium, while radiating energy across light years of empty space. Those stars did not know about Benny, or the Mojave, or humanity's struggle to survive in radioactive ruins. They would continue burning long after the last human had died, would eventually expand and cool and collapse into white dwarfs or neutron stars or black holes, depending on their mass and composition. The universe operated on timescales that made human concerns seem less than irrelevant, made even the nuclear war that had destroyed civilization look like brief flicker in a history measured in billions of years. But humans were not stars. We're not built for that kind of vast indifference. Humans needed stories, needed to believe that their choices mattered, and their lives had meaning, and the struggle to survive was about something more than just biological imperative. Benny's story provided that meaning for the people who remembered it, offered the comfort of believing that the universe had some kind of moral structure, even if that structure was harsh and unforgiving. He had reached too high and fallen too far, had betrayed trust and paid for that betrayal, had tried to cheat the wasteland and discovered that the wasteland could not be cheated. That narrative satisfied the human need for justice even when actual justice was messier and more ambiguous than the story suggested. The Mojave Desert, spread under those indifferent stars, vast and hostile and beautiful in ways that required suffering to properly appreciate. The mountains that ringed the valley had existed for millions of years before humans arrived, and would exist for millions of years after humans departed. The Colorado River that fed Hoover Dam had carved its path over geological timescales that made individual human lives look like quantum fluctuations. The radiation that soaked into everything would persist for thousands of years, slowly decaying according to half-lives determined by physics rather than hope or prayer or political ideology. Against that vast backdrop of deep time and fundamental forces, one man's ambition seemed less like tragedy and more like cosmic joke. Brief spark of consciousness, believing itself important enough to matter to universe that noticed it not at all. But the people who told Benny's story did not have access to cosmic perspective, lived instead in immediate present, where choices had consequences and actions mattered, and the difference between life and death was measured in millimeters and milliseconds rather than light years and geological epochs. For them, Benny's story was tragedy because it was their tragedy too. Their dreams of being more than the wasteland had made them, their ambitions to reshape the world according to visions that existed only in their own heads. They saw themselves in his failure, recognized their own desperate hunger for something better reflected in his schemes and betrayals. That recognition made the story personal even for people who had never met him, transformed historical figure into mirror that reflected their own fears about reaching too high and falling too far. The wind that blew across the Mojave carried sand that had once been mountains, dust that had once been cities, molecules that had once been people, living and loving and dying in ways they believed mattered. That wind blew without preference or plan, followed physics rather than purpose, created patterns that looked meaningful but were just turbulence expressing itself through natural law. Benny had wanted to control the wind, had tried to bend it to his will through cleverness and planning, and the belief that understanding systems meant you could manipulate them. The wind had blown anyway, carried him along with everything else, deposited him wherever physics dictated regardless of what he wanted or planned or believed he deserved. The checkered suit, wherever it existed in physical form or memory or imagination, became symbol for everything Benny had tried to be and everything he had failed to become. The suit represented civilization, the pre-war world where style mattered and appearance meant something, and you could wear costume that transformed you into someone different from what you were born to be. But underneath the suit had always been the tribal savage, the boot rider who had learned young that survival meant taking what you needed before someone else took it from you. The suit had not changed that fundamental nature, had just hidden it temporarily until circumstances stripped away the disguise and revealed what had been there all along. Perhaps that was the final lesson worth extracting from the accumulated weight of Benny's story and its aftermath. You could change your costume, but you could not change what you were. Could learn new behaviors, but could not escape the psychological patterns that early trauma had burned into your consciousness. Transformation was possible, but it required more than just putting on an expensive suit and learning to speak smoothly. It required confronting the violence that had shaped you, accepting the scars rather than hiding them, building new identity on foundation of honest acknowledgement rather than elaborate denial. Benny had never done that work, had never faced what the boot riders had made him, and that failure had proven more fatal than any bullet. The lucky 38 tower stood against the night sky, lit or dark depending on who controlled it and what they wanted it to represent. The structure was monument to one man's refusal to accept that the old world was dead, physical embodiment of the belief that pre-war genius could resurrect civilization from radioactive ashes if given enough time and resources. House had succeeded in that resurrection, at least partially, had created Vegas when everyone else believed such creation was impossible. But his success had required trusting lieutenants to manage pieces of his empire, and that trust had been betrayed by the person who seemed most trustworthy because he seemed most transformed. The tower stood as reminder that even genius could not account for every variable, that perfect plans were impossible in a universe that included human psychology and all its contradictions. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the city lights, beyond the reach of Securitron patrols and NCR checkpoints and Legion scouts, the true wasteland continued its patient work of destroying everything humans built and reducing it back to component elements. Radiation and time and entropy worked together with the slow inevitability of natural law, breaking down structures and consuming corpses, and returning everything to dust that the wind would scatter across territory too large for anyone to fully control. That process was the only permanence the wasteland offered, the one guarantee that applied equally to the powerful and the powerless. Everyone ended up as dust. Everything became ruins. The universe moved toward maximum entropy regardless of human efforts to impose order or meaning or lasting significance on temporary arrangements of matter. But temporary was not the same as meaningless. And the people who lived in those brief intervals between birth and death needed to believe that their struggles mattered even if the ultimate outcome was predetermined by thermodynamics. Benny's story mattered to them because it was about trying to matter, about refusing to accept the role the universe had assigned you, about reaching for something more even when reaching was almost certainly fatal. He had failed in his reach. But the fact that he had reached at all made him memorable in a place where most people were too beaten down or too pragmatic to attempt anything beyond basic survival. His failure was tragedy, but his attempt was something approaching heroism, even if the methods were morally bankrupt and the motivation was entirely selfish. The night deepened toward that hour, when darkness was most complete, when even the radiation glow seemed to fade, and the stars became clearer, and the desert remembered what it had been like before humans arrived with their violence and ambition and desperate need to transform emptiness into meaning. In that hour the Mojave was neither hostile nor welcoming, simply existing according to its own logic that included humans as minor variables rather than central concerns. The casinos glowed against that darkness, tiny bubbles of light and noise and frantic activity that believed themselves important, while the desert waited with geological patience for them to fail and fall and return to the silence that was the region's natural state. The courier, wherever they had gone after the battle and the choices and the assumption of power or rejection of it, carried Benny's story with them in ways both conscious and unconscious. They were the only person who could fully understand what had happened that night in Goodsprings, the moment between the gun firing and the grave closing, the experience of being murdered and buried, and then somehow surviving to change everything. That experience had transformed them as surely as the boot riders had transformed young Benny, had given them perspective that no one else could share because no one else had died and refused to accept death's claim. They were living proof that the wasteland's verdicts were not always final, that resilience could triumph over planning, that sometimes the person you tried to eliminate became the force that destroyed everything you had built. In Goodsprings, in the cemetery where it had all begun, the wind moved through weathered tombstones and disturbed the earth that had been disturbed once before by someone crawling out of their own grave. The ground was just ground, dirt and rock, and the occasional bone fragment from occupants who had stayed buried when burial was attempted. But people who visited felt something there, whether that something was real or imagined, or some combination that existed in the uncertain territory between objective reality and subjective experience. They felt the weight of what had happened, the significance of the moment when one man's careful plan had encountered one person's refusal to cooperate with death. The grave marker, simple and anonymous, bore no names because names were unnecessary. Everyone who cared already knew whose grave this was supposed to be, whose body had occupied it briefly before clawing back to life and vengeance, and eventually to whatever form of peace or power they had claimed after the fighting ended. The marker existed to remind people that the impossible sometimes happened, that graves did not always keep what was buried, that the universe occasionally produced outcomes that defied logic and probability and every reasonable expectation. The radiation storms on the horizon painted the sky in colors that pre-war eyes would have found terrifying, but wasteland residents barely noticed anymore. Green and blue and sick yellow, aurora, born from atomic fire rather than solar wind, beauty created through catastrophe and persisting because half-lives measured time in thousands of years. Those storms had witnessed everything from beginning to end, had glowed over the boot rider camps, and the rise of New Vegas and the battle at Hoover Dam had illuminated the Mojave during Benny's brief moment in the spotlight, and would continue illuminating it long after everyone had forgotten his name. The desert kept its final secret, the truth about what happened to Benny's consciousness, if consciousness survived death, about whether he experienced regret or vindication or simply nothing at all when the end came. That secret would never be revealed because the dead did not speak and the living could only speculate. But the speculation itself became part of the legend, people arguing about whether Benny had understood his mistakes in final moments, or had died, blaming everyone except himself for outcomes he had created through choices he had made freely. The coyotes that prowled the edges of settlements made sounds that could have been mourning or hunger, or simple communication between pack members coordinating hunts. Those sounds had existed before humans, and would exist after them, animals pursuing survival through methods refined over thousands of generations of evolution. They did not care about Benny, or Vegas, or any human drama. They cared about food and reproduction, and avoiding predators, the basic imperatives that governed all life regardless of whether that life had achieved self-awareness and built civilizations that believed themselves important. The Mojave stretched toward horizons that promised nothing except more desert, more struggle, more opportunities to discover whether you were strong enough or smart enough or lucky enough to survive another day. That was all the wasteland ever offered, another day of existence purchased through vigilance and violence, and the willingness to do whatever necessary to see another sunrise. Benny had wanted more than that, had believed he deserved empire and legacy and transformation of the wasteland according to his vision. The desert had disagreed with that assessment, had taught him the same lesson it taught everyone. Eventually, you got what you could take and keep, and keeping was always harder than taking. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided travelers before compasses and GPS, and even before humans had developed language to name the constellations they saw. Those patterns would continue guiding after humans were gone, would help whatever species evolved next to navigate their world and build their civilizations, and eventually destroy themselves through weapons they should never have created. The cycle would repeat because cycles always repeated, patterns emerging from chaos and dissolving back into it, temporary islands of order in an ocean of entropy that claimed everything eventually. And in the Tops Casino, in the penthouse that Benny had occupied, in the space where he had planned betrayals and dreamed of kingdoms and stared at the lucky 38 with hunger that would never be satisfied, the wind moved through broken windows or sealed rooms depending on what had happened after he fell. The space held memories, if spaces could hold such things, echoes of conversations and schemes, and the particular quality of ambition that believed itself justified by the harshness of the environment that had produced it. Those memories did not judge and did not forgive, simply existed in whatever form memories took when separated from the minds that had created them. The final word on Benny's legend, if legends required final words rather than continuing forever in forms that changed with each generation that retold them, was simply this: he tried. In a wasteland that destroyed most people before they could attempt anything beyond survival, he had tried to become something more. He had failed catastrophically, had created consequences that killed hundreds and reshaped a region, and probably made the Mojave worse rather than better in aggregate. But he had tried, and the trying mattered even when the results were disaster. Mattered because it proved that the wasteland had not completely destroyed the human capacity for ambition, even if it had destroyed the wisdom required to direct that ambition toward productive ends. The night pressed down with weight that felt like judgment, but was just atmospheric pressure, physics expressing itself through gas molecules and gravity, and the fundamental forces that govern matter, whether that matter was aware of itself or not. The Mojave existed under that pressure, had existed under it for millions of years, and would exist under it for millions more, unconcerned with brief flickerings of consciousness that believed themselves significant while lasting less time than it took for mountains to erode into sand. But for the humans who lived in that brief flicker, who struggled and loved and died in the space between sunrise and sunset, the story of the man in the checkered suit who shot a hero and started a war would continue resonating through bars and campfires and quiet conversations between people who understood that they too were reaching for something beyond what the wasteland had assigned them. They would tell the story and learn from it, or ignore its lessons, would become their own cautionary tales, or would succeed where Benny failed, would write their own chapters in the Mojave's endless book of violence and survival and desperate human need to believe that existence meant something beyond the simple fact of continuing to exist. The wind kept blowing across empty graves and full ones, across the living and the dead, and those in uncertain territory between. It carried the smell of creosote and radiation, and distant rain that might never fall. It carried the sound of bottle caps rattling in pockets and weapons being cleaned, and generators humming their eternal song of resistance against entropy. It carried everything and nothing, moving because movement was what wind did, following physics without purpose or plan, or any quality that resembled human intention. And somewhere in that wind, mixed with dust and memory, and the ghost traces of everyone who had ever walked the Mojave and died here, was Benny, not as person, but as legend, not as body, but as story, not as failure, but as warning, that the next ambitious person would probably ignore until it was too late. And they became the next chapter in the endless book of people who tried to cheat the wasteland and discovered that the wasteland could not be cheated. The checkered suit hung empty, or was worn, or was buried, and it did not matter which, because the suit had never been the point. The point was what the suit represented. The belief that you could transform yourself through costume and confidence, and refusal to accept the limitations that circumstances tried to impose. The belief was beautiful even when it was fatal, hopeful even when it was foolish, human in ways that transcended the specific person who had embodied it most dramatically. The Mojave night deepened toward dawn, the eternal cycle continuing regardless of human drama or cosmic indifference. The stars faded as the sun prepared to rise and begin again the daily work of making existence possible, while simultaneously making it almost unbearable. The casinos prepared for new guests who would gamble and lose and convince themselves that next time luck would favor them differently. The settlements prepared for another day of survival, another cycle of trading and fighting, and the thousand small negotiations required to keep breathing an environment designed to stop your heart. And in Good Springs, in the cemetery where a courier had been shot and buried and had refused to stay dead, the earth settled over bones that belonged to people whose stories were less dramatic, but no less real, whose lives had mattered to someone even if history had forgotten to remember them. The grave that had started everything sat among them, marked or unmarked, significant or forgotten depending on who was looking and what they were looking for. The sun broke the horizon, painting the desert in colors that could have been beautiful if you had the luxury of appreciating beauty when survival required constant vigilance. The Mojave woke to another day of heat and radiation, and the endless struggle between life trying to persist and entropy, trying to reduce everything to equilibrium. The day would bring violence and trade and birth and death and all the normal activities of wasteland existence. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. Just another day in a place where days were currency you spent without knowing how many remained in your account. The story of Benny, the man in the checkered suit who shot a hero and started a war, would be told again that day somewhere in the Mojave. Someone would mention him to teach a lesson, or win an argument, or simply to fill silence with words. The details would be slightly different from the last telling, mutated by memory and intention, and the storyteller's relationship to truth. But the core would remain the same, because the core was what mattered, what made the story worth remembering and retelling across years and miles, and the vast gulf between those who had been there and those who inherited only second-hand accounts. The wasteland kept turning, kept destroying and creating, kept teaching its lessons to anyone who survived long enough to learn them. And somewhere in the ruins and radiation and desperate human struggle to find meaning in chaos, Benny's ghost walked if ghosts existed, or his memory persisted. If memory was the only form of immortality the wasteland granted, or his story continued being told because stories were how humans fought against the entropy that claimed everything else. The wind blew. The radiation glowed. The desert stretched toward horizons that promised nothing and delivered exactly what they promised. And in the silence between gunshots and laughter, between the last breath of the dying and the first cry of the newly born, the Mojave wasteland kept its eternal counsel about whether any of it had mattered at all. The stars burned on, indifferent and eternal, witnesses to everything and testament to nothing. Good night.